Buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning. Today is going to be more difficult to resist to the temptation of going to the beach because we have a wonderful weather this morning.
Bien, hoy vamos.
Today we will be speaking about the situation in the Middle East. This is not a confrontation between Israel and Palestine, but unavoidably we will have to speak about the conflict that has lasted now many years, many years. And the Hamas terrorist attack is not the first event of a long series of events. And we have 3-4 people. Are we going to have a video conference connection? First of all, Jean-Pierre Fillieu, professor in Sciences Po in Paris. He's a professor specialized in contemporary history for the Middle East. I've read his books, and I feel privileged of meeting him and getting to know his work. He's been a professor in Columbia, Georgetown. He started working in his career in Syria, Afghanistan, the U.S. He's worked with interior ministers, defense ministers, and in the year 2002, is that right? As a diplomatic advisor of the French Prime Minister. Let's see what's going to happen now in France. But at the time, we had the President Chirac and First Minister Jospin. And in fact, Jospin is someone that I really admire from the political standpoint, and he is a reference for me. You have received many awards. I'm not going to read the whole list of them, but it's impressive the number of awards you've received thanks to your contribution to history from a non-religious perspective, because we have a non-religious perspective of the Middle East, while we usually have this view of this challenge between religions. We also have Philippe Lazzarini with us, who is since March 2020, Commissioner General of the famous UNRWA that no one knew too well, but that now absolutely everyone knows because of what they do. This is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. So they assist the Palestinian refugees that had to leave Israel when Israel was being created in the first wars at that time. Lazzarini has a very tough task because he's in charge of making an organization that works in the most adverse situation, not only in Gaza, but wherever there are Palestine refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, in the West Bank, and he will be telling us his vision. I hope to also have with us Fania Ossalzberger, who is also a historian, who works in the University of Haifa and other universities. She was born in a kibbutz and was educated in a kibbutz, and of course was part of the Israeli army training. and she can give us a historical vision from the standpoint of an Israeli historian. And then we also have a researcher and a political advisor that has worked in 8 national political campaigns in Israel and other 15 countries. She's a policy fellow and co-hosts the Tel Aviv Review podcast. So she's a journalist, a researcher, and political advisor. She also works in the Haaretz newspaper that is very representative of the left in Israeli society. And she can give us the sociological viewpoint. And later on, we will have a connection. We will have a connection with a specialist on the Middle East from Jordan. No, we don't have him, finally? No, unfortunately, he won't be able to join us. We would have loved to also have the view of a researcher, more or less what Dalia does here in Madrid at the Elcano Institute. And he's Jordan Spanish, but unfortunately, he won't be able to join us. He's in Puerto Rico. Who would like to be in Puerto Rico when you can be in Santander? In any case, he could have been able to give us a very interesting vision too. I hope later on we can have a connection with Fania, and if not, we have the 3 of you here. And I will first give the floor to Professor Filiu, a historian that knows, like anyone, the history of the Middle East, and he's wonderful. So thank you. Thank you so much for your kind introductory words, and thank you even more for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of the QUO VADIS program. And as it was foreseen, I will be speaking in English.
No, el inglés, la globalización.
I will be speaking in English. It's all due to globalization. The language for war and peace, but let's make it the language of peace.
Universidad Internacional Menéndez Pelayo and everybody who made it possible. A very special tribute to Josep Borrell, not only because he's our host today, but mainly because he represents to me the very embodiment of a true intellectual who, in his various political avatars, remained faithful to his commitment to change and progress. I'm proud to share the stage with such a distinguished speaker from Israel, Dalia Scheindlin, but also with Philippe Lazzarini, whose UNRWA keeps fulfilling its international mandate despite an extremely violent campaign of vicious smearing on the international arena and repeated bombing in the Gaza Strip. When it comes to EU and the Middle East, I have been addressing this topic in lectures, symposiums, roundtables, and workshops for the past 2 decades, whether in Europe, in the Middle East, or in North America, where I have even taught a master course, a graduate course on the subject at the School of Foreign Service of Georgetown University. I was then, imagine for a French, the BMW professor of European Studies. One of the ironic highlights of my career, since I don't even own a car. It's not Gallic pride, it's a French joke. You can laugh. Okay, well. But today, and it's not funny at all, I will strongly speak from the point of view of a European citizen who wants Europe to be a success story not only for today, but also for the generations to come. A true realist who wants European money, energy, and prestige not to be wasted in vain, but to be invested in the only realistic long-term perspective in the Middle East, which for Europe means peace and a lasting and sustainable peace. In speaking that strongly, I will strongly disagree and part ways with the self-proclaimed realist who have only brought Europe, to use a very mild understatement, into the current impasse in the Middle East. Those self-proclaimed realists pretended in 2003 that the road to peace in the Middle East went not through the full implementation of the Israeli-Palestinian peace agreements, but through the invasion of Iraq. Despite the massive protest all over Europe against this useless war that turned into a catastrophe for both Europe and the Middle East. But the extent of this catastrophe didn't deter the unrepentant Tony Blair, who moved in 2007 from British Prime Minister to Quartet envoy to the Middle East. Quartet means US, UN, EU, and Russia at that time. And Tony Blair started claiming that the Israeli-Palestinian dispute could be solved through the proactive development of the Palestinian economy. And he started to bet on West Bank first. Let us forget Gaza. Of course, as you all know, Palestinians would be so happy to be richer that they would drop their national claims. And Gazan people will be so envious of West Bankers that they would topple Hamas. And those were the so-called realists. Blair left in 2015, after 8 years of blockade of Gaza, without Europe lifting a finger to lift the blockade. While in 2012 I concluded the original edition of my Gaza history by saying that peace between Israel and Palestine can assume neither meaning nor substance except in Gaza. In 2014, I warned that plunging the Gaza Strip into permanent insecurity in the name of Israeli security is not only a tragic illusion but a strategic error. Repeatedly, I advised European decision makers to open a sea route between the European territory of Cyprus and Gaza in order to alleviate the Israeli-Egyptian blockade. Too complicated, I was answered. Let us be realist. Realist. What a very sad joke. I had been going in and out of the Gaza Strip for the past 4 decades, and if I knew one thing, it was that this illusion of a status quo was not sustainable. Such a pipe dream went through a new dimension with the Abraham Accords between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. War is bad, and peace is good, so shut up, it's over. And the self-proclaimed realist went banging the drums about their global peace victory. And those false realists, through their decision and their non-decision, since abstention is also a political act, brought us, all of them, to the current catastrophe. So let us be realist, but real realists once and for all. Not phony realists or ideologues revamped as realists by spin doctors. America cannot bring peace to the Middle East. It proved it in 2020 with the collapse of the Trump-Netanyahu so-called deal of the century. It proved it in 2021 when Joe Biden endorsed Donald Trump's fait accompli, including the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And it is lamentably proving it right now with its inability to implement even a ceasefire in Gaza after nearly a year of massacres. It couldn't even deliver more than 1 day need of aid through its hundreds of millions of dollars worth jetty. Only Europe can bring and sustain peace in the Middle East. But the problem with the EU is not the means, which are plenty and numerous, but the will. And I do argue today in front of you that Europe has no choice if it wants to survive as a rule of law-based institution. So in the 15 plus minutes that are left to me, I will concentrate on that existential question with a twofold argument. First, there is very little chance for Ukraine, you can fight like Ukrainians. It's a statement that I wanted to bring to you today. For Ukraine to prevail against Russia if Putin remains the main winner of the current Middle East crisis. Second, the very fate of Europe is at stake in Gaza, because all the principles on which the EU has been built so far are blatantly violated on a daily and systematic basis. My first point stems from my own solidarity with the Ukrainian resistance. I spent 2 months last year in Ukraine, including one teaching at the Mohila Academy in Kiev, the Middle Eastern dimension of the Russian aggression. Well, there is today quite a consensus in Europe that Putin constitutes an existential threat for the EU, and EU undertook a strategic shift to confront such a challenge. Unfortunately, this shift occurred 1 decade too late, a decade during which the Kremlin had plenty of time to accumulate resources, develop war techniques, and consolidate alliances that would prove both crucial and devastating to attack Ukraine. I have big news for you. Putin is using stereo, while the West is pathetically stuck on solo despite its technological superiority. Middle East and Europe are one and only strategic theater for the Kremlin, while the West is still distinguishing between the noble NATO European theater from the Oriental Middle Eastern one. Well, you know, the countdown to the annexion of Crimea and the current war in Ukraine was launched in Syria with the chemical bombings on Damascus in 2013. The drones that are hitting Ukraine so hard were developed in Syria, in the Palmyra Desert, thanks to Iran's strong cooperation and even alliance with Russia. And the price Europe paid in 2015 was the refugee crisis and the jihadi terror wave. But Netanyahu and Putin remained big fans and big pals. Netanyahu even went on the Red Square for the victory parade in 2018. So while you hear so many times, oh, Israel can depend only on Israel for its own security, well, it's a lie, because Netanyahu already is already depending for its security on the northern border on Russia, betting that Russia would stop or at least control Iran's influence near the Golan. So no use shouting against US and UN. Benjamin Netanyahu, you can call him Bibi, you know, it's a mark of affection and respect among his fans. Netanyahu is dancing to Putin's tune. So not one cartridge was delivered by Israel to Ukraine, while Ukraine dramatically requested air defense. And we saw during the Iranian attack last April how the whole West moved to defend effectively and quite successfully Israel, while the same attacks were taking place on a weekly and sometimes a daily basis against Ukraine. Even worse, Christian Zionists controlling the US Congress are giving absolute priority to Netanyahu compared to Zelensky. Look at the 2 recent visits of both of them. While nearly 1 year was lost in Ukraine, while the devastation went full gear in Gaza. Even worse than worst, the paralysis of the UN and the double standard. Well, you all understand, I said double standard, I could say now diplomatic schizophrenia. How can you expect to condemn occupation, annexation, systematic bombing of civilian infrastructures in Ukraine while accepting them even indirectly in Gaza? Imagine if Ukraine was covered by international press like Gaza, with all the foreign correspondents being based in Moscow, with foreign journalists being admitted into Ukraine only escorted by the Russian army, with news, quote unquote, from Ukraine only coming from the social networks, while local journalists will be targeted and killed. The whole West would shout and rebel and not accept the situation that is inflicted on Gaza for nearly a year. So such a blatant double standard can only fuel in Europe mistrust against the institution, especially among the youth, which in turn reinforces the populist trend that is globally pro-Russian and pro-Netanyahu. I have a great respect for Netanyahu as one of the shrewdest and toughest politicians in today's world. I have even written his only biography in French. Netanyahu did his homework, starting in Hungary a long time ago with his good friend Viktor Orban, to promote an ethno-nationalist Europe against a rule of law Europe. Illiberal democracy. Netanyahu loves Orban and hates George Soros. You don't have to be a science professor to remind and be conscious that free and fair elections are only one component of a democratic system that cannot live and prosper without institutions and counterpowers, checks and balances. Which provides me with a convenient transition to the second leg of my existential interrogation. The very fate of Europe is at stake in Gaza. I even wrote on January 1st in Le Monde, where I have a weekly column since 2015, that the fate of Europe is at stake in Gaza in this very year of 2024. The same way the very fate of the Middle East is depending on the intensity of EU positive and constructive involvement. I even published 4 days after the October 7 terrorist bloodbath an essay about the Middle East in 2050 with the expected 3 scenarios: rosy, neutral, gray, black, each evolution depending mainly on the extent and degree of EU involvement. Just to give you an indication of I raise the expectation for Europe. The problem, and it's a fascinating problem for historians, but a depressing problem for an EU citizen, is that the EU is a power afraid of its own shadow, a power afraid of being a power. You might know the popular saying in the humanitarian networks: in the Middle East, the US decide, the EU pays, and the UN feed. But that was before the ongoing catastrophe, and that is now definitely over. The US cannot even decide on a ceasefire. And since the UN cannot even feed decently some 2 million women and men and children in Gaza, the EU is left hanging in thin air. And there is absolutely no fatality to such a collective impotence, especially since the two-state solution has been repeatedly assigned as a strategic objective by the EU. Strategic objective? Well, move for it. Move for this strategic objective. I will only take 2 examples. First, democracy in the Palestinian Authority, which we all agree is one of the main obstacles to the two-state solution. Well, in 2021, elections were planned to be held for the presidency, for the parliament, and all the polls indicated that Hamas would lose Gaza, that Sinwar would have lost Gaza. But Mahmoud Abbas, in order to remain president for life of the PA, decided to postpone indefinitely the election. Did the EU protest? No. In fact, many people in the EU were quite alleviated. No election with the Palestinians. We never know how they could vote. Well, you know, this is again the result. Sinwar could have been taken out of Gaza democratically. That was only 3 years ago. Second, the International Court of Justice just ruled that, I'm quoting, "It is for all states, while respecting the Charter of the UN and international law, to ensure that any impediment resulting from the illegal presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory to the exercise of the Palestinian people of its right of self-determination is brought to an end." To an end. So I know what the legal department of the European Commission commented on that regard. I've been through that as a former diplomat myself. But we all know that despite those communiques, the EU could do much more, much more, just to keep in line with international law. Especially, and remember, non-decision can be as binding as clear-cut decision, especially when the frustration is growing fast, especially among the European youth, about the abysmal chiasm between words and deeds when it comes to Gaza. And this is probably the main threat for Europe, emanating from the Middle East. Not the threat of terror attacks or uncontrolled mass immigration, a more intimate threat that could jeopardize the delicate balance of the rule of law inside the very European institution. I want to insist on that. Without peace in the Middle East, there will still be an European Commission, a European Parliament, Council of Foreign Affairs, and Euro, and so on and so forth. But those institutions would have lost their meaning and therefore their substance and efficiency by escaping their duty to enforce the rule of law in a region that is so intimately linked to Europe. Sorry I couldn't elaborate, but I would be happy to tell more if you are interested in the Q&A. So let us wrap up my argument. Can USA live without peace in the Middle East? Yes. Can Russia live without peace in the Middle East? Of course. Can China live without peace in the Middle East? Yes. Can Turkey live without peace in the Middle East? Of course. Can Iran live without peace in the Middle East? Of course. Can the Arab regimes live without peace in the Middle East? Yes, and this is the very reason some of them signed the Abraham Accords with Israel. Can Israel live without peace in the Middle East? Definitely no, even though it is now under what the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, the writer of Sapiens and Deus, described as the Samson syndrome. You know, Samson killing all the Palestinians and Philistines and getting killed in the same way. A two-state solution would be, from the historian point of view, the historical victory not only of Zionism but for Israel, because it would definitely mark the success of this historical project. It would be a win-win for Israelis and Palestinians. Otherwise, it will be an eternal cycle of war and a lose-lose for both people. Can the Palestinians live without peace in the Middle East? Obviously, no. And you can give this answer after a simple look at the devastation of Gaza. Can Europe live without peace in the Middle East? Obviously, no. It's the only true realist answer, with Europe being the only honest broker available for both Israelis and Palestinians. But the time is now, not tomorrow, today, before it's too late for Europe, too late for Israel, too late for Palestine, and too late for peace. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, because it has been the view. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you. It hasn't been only the viewpoint of the historian who is going to take us on a journey, but it is going to show us the perspective. Thank you for talking about what is happening in Ukraine and in the Middle East, because I think it is one of the most advantages taken is by Putin. It is sad, but this situation is in Europe is in a situation, and the whole world is telling us that we have different attitudes and a double standard. Thank you for telling us the truth, because Europeans, we haven't done what we should have done. We have limited ourselves to proclaim the needs of the two states, and we haven't done a great thing. We only have given funds to the
of Palestine Authority, but it's not a real solution. And the future of Europe is going to be played in Gaza, nor Palestine or Israel can live without the peace in Middle East. So we are calling to a greater engagement of the Europeans, and because of the conflict, the EU is too much divided to play the role that our friend Filiu is asking for. We could maybe give the floor. What is the order of the panel? And Fania is online, so we are going to give her the floor. Thank you, Fania, for being here on Zoom, of course. We know you haven't been able to come because you have had problems with your flights, but we hear you. Yours is the floor, madam.
I am assuming it is my time to speak, but since I do not follow Spanish very well, I just want to make sure that this is the case.
Sí. Te estoy dando la palabra. Lo siento, quizás no has podido oír. I am giving you the floor. I'm giving you the floor. It's your time to speak.
Yes, thank you so much. And my apologies for not being in the wonderful Santander in person. I'm grateful for the invitation. Unfortunately, Air Europe has canceled its flights from Israel until yesterday, so I was unable to come. I would like to pick up the words of the previous speaker and tell you how much I had hoped as an Israeli liberal and peace activist, as a representative of the part of Israeli civil society which is horrified by the war in Gaza these days, which is horrified by the way our government is conducting the war in Gaza. No less horrified, of course, by the unprecedented massacre conducted by Hamas on the 7th of October, that I have been calling for the last 20 years upon the European Union and its government and its parliament to step in and deliver a hands-on direct treatment of our part of the Middle East in order to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I've been saying that since the 2000s. I've been calling upon several different EU leaders and foreign ministers to enter the fray, to put the significant pressure of the European Union upon both Israelis and Palestinians, upon the leaderships of both sides. And I did that because I knew since the late 90s and again the late 2000s that Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud government is not going to resolve the crisis, but to make it worse. And I knew it because the Likud party, ever since it came under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu in the 1990s, has done everything it could to undo, I'm sorry about my dogs, undo the Oslo agreement, the Oslo process between the late Yitzhak Rabin's government and the Palestinian leadership of the PLO, Fatah, the Palestinian Authority created by the Oslo agreements. The direction was going as it should towards a full peace agreement based on the two-states solution just mentioned here. And many of us wanted that, including the majority who voted for Yitzhak Rabin, the late Yitzhak Rabin. But we knew that Netanyahu's Likud, unlike previous Likud governments and leaders, has decided to undo the Oslo process, to delegitimize the Fatah leadership, and to embrace Hamas in order to achieve those goals. Increasingly, over the last decade, the Netanyahu government has been pumping Qatari resources into the Gaza Strip, into the hands of Hamas, not only for humanitarian reasons, not only for humanitarian reasons, but also in order to kill peace, to kill the prospects of the Oslo process. I begged the EU to step in, and as we have heard, the EU did not have the power, the resolve, the diplomatic courage to step in. The Americans did. Different presidents, different approaches. The Trump regime was a huge support to the anti-peace Netanyahu government of Israel. And this was a disappointment. Things can still change. I call upon the EU to step in now with all its weight, and I'm not afraid to say its moral weight, its historical weight, its historical memory of how this conflict began, which was a joint and combined tragedy, a blended tragedy of the Jews, the refugees of the Holocaust, my own grandparents, my own 4 grandparents, and the Palestinians who deserve and are entitled to their own country alongside Israel. This is the only way out. This is the only bloodless way out. Any other way, except for the 2 states model, will bring rivers of blood again to the Middle East, and perhaps not only to our part of the Middle East, perhaps not only to the Middle East at all. So my part of the Israeli society, of the Israeli civil society, our mindset, which is peacenik, not starry-eyed pacifist. We do not believe in making peace with terrorists. We do believe in making peace with moderate Palestinian leaders, is aching for this kind of international assertive support, even if it runs contrary to the agenda of our own current government, which will not for long remain our own current government, because it has sinned not only against civilians, those civilians who are innocent in Gaza, it has also sinned dramatically, demonically against its own citizens by allowing the 7th of October to happen, by abandoning the residents on the Gaza border to their fate, and now, after over 300 days, abandoning the hostages to their fate. This government will have to go, and we know that it will. But it would be a great help if international powers, who are, as previously said, honest brokers, and I use that term in my articles pleading with the EU to step in, honest brokers would begin forcing, and I'm using the word forcing, both sides to the negotiations table. I have to say a word about UNRWA. Unfortunately, I'm not there in the flesh, and I've not met Mr. Lazzarini in the flesh. But I have to say, with a sad heart, but this is the truth of the matter, that UNRWA, as we see it, as peace-minded Israelis see it, as liberal Zionists like myself see it, is an enemy of the 2-state solution. It's our own enemy. And I'm not saying this because we have facts on the ground that some UNRWA employees took part in the massacre, and that many other UNRWA employees cheered them on and celebrated the 7th of October. We know that much. This is not why I'm saying that UNRWA is not on my side or on the side of peace in the form of the 2-state solution. It has been shown that UNRWA institutes, hospitals, schools, accommodated tunnels and weaponry, arsenals and warriors of Hamas within the premises. I will not go into the question whether it was correct to bomb those schools and hospitals the way Israel did in some cases. It was possibly wrong. It's too early for me to decide what in my countries and my armies' actions in Gaza were constituted a war crime and what did not, what was just war. This will have to be resolved, but there is no question that UNRWA institutes were deeply involved in the Hamas war machine. But even this is not my main argument against UNRWA and its leadership, but rather that this whole organization was created in the 1950s and went on for the last 60, 70 years to encourage the perennial refugee status of the Palestinians rather than finding a peaceful end for it. To help and raise and educate generation after generation of people with a powerful sense of their refugee identity, whose only future horizon was to destroy Israel and create a Palestinian state, not alongside it, but instead of it, on its ruins. UNRWA has been part of that. And ever since UNRWA started working with the newly elected Hamas government in 2007, and until today, with, as we have heard, no ongoing democracy or elections in Gaza, UNRWA has essentially, in its deeds, in its actions, in its policies, supported Hamas in the sense of supporting the Hamas intentions, the Hamas narratives of destroying Israel and creating a so-called one-state solution, which is a Palestinian state only, over the ruins of my home, over the bodies of my family, or else drive us out. This, to us, is unforgivable. And therefore, despite my appreciation as a human being to the necessary, indeed crucial assistance that UNRWA is now giving the civilians of Gaza, I cannot see UNRWA as part of the solution, but unfortunately as part of the problem. This is the way we, the peace camp in Israel, see it, and this is unfortunate. Let me draw to a close with a description of my own future horizon. What I would like to see in this bloodbath called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I would like to see a change of leadership in both Israel and Gaza. And in the case of Israel, it's coming. We, the pro-democracy protesters, have not yet managed to topple the Netanyahu government, but we will. And if the worst comes to the worst, which I hope it doesn't, we will vote it out of office in 2026. I still do not see a change of government in Gaza, for obvious reasons, unless it is imposed by the international community, which it should. I see a Fatah-led government taking over both Gaza and the West Bank. I see the beginning of territorial negotiations, looking out for a territorial compromise. In the case of Israel, you will have to convince, to persuade about 70% of the Israelis that this is the right solution, because 30%, like myself, already think or have thought for a very long time that this is the right solution. In the case of the Palestinians, unfortunately, over 90% will have to be persuaded to let go of the dream of coming back to every Palestinian home abandoned in 1948, to every part of the land, and to create a thriving, independent, sovereign Palestine in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and perhaps with a few accommodations of the border of the Green Line as it is drawn today. This is enormous work. This is an enormous task to persuade both Israelis and Palestinians, but we have to begin somewhere. I can promise you that the next Israeli government, which is likely to be a center-left coalition, a liberal coalition, democratic coalition, would at least embark on this process. I cannot assure you, because I cannot speak for the Palestinians, that there would be an equivalent Palestinian effort to move forward to the two-state solution. There is a lot of bad blood between the two nations, and there is a lot of persuasion that has to take place. We need the help of the responsible adults of the international community. And the European Union is first and foremost among them, along with what I hope would be the next regime, the next administration in the United States. And alongside the moderate Arab states, the Gulf, Egypt, perhaps others who would join in. We do have a coalition of moderates in the pipeline. And we should be able to make the peace of the moderates. If enough courageous Israelis and Palestinians receive enough support from the world. This is where I trust not those following the agenda of Hamas, not those calling in the social networks and in the media all over the world for the eradication of Israel, for the annihilation of Israel, for killing or driving out the Jews from Israel. And unfortunately, not those who believe that in one state, Jews and Palestinians can live happily ever after, because we can't. Not in this generation, not after the 7th of October. We need a strong border to make good neighbors. As the poet Robert Frost once said, a strong fence makes good neighbors. So please, once again, as I wrote in 2010 and 2012, please give us a strong European input into the process. Make our leaders do it, our respective leaders do it. Help us calm down the extreme voices in the social networks. A few of them are pro-Israel or pretending to be pro-Israel by saying that Israel should eradicate Gaza and somehow put a violent end to the Palestinian issue. But especially in the world media, those who say that Israel has lost its or never had its right to exist and should be annihilated. We need to calm down these voices. We need to educate the younger people in the history, the complex, nuanced history of the conflict. And most of all, we need a strong moderator in this very difficult but doable procedure. And the immediate run, I'm using this stage to call upon my government. I'm not calling upon Hamas. You don't plead with vile enemies, but I'm calling upon my government to do its utmost right now to release the remaining hostages and to cease fire in Gaza. This is my Israeli voice. And as said, I believe that I represent between 30 and 50% of Israelis, depending on how you frame the issues. But this is a big chunk of our society. We are horribly sad. We are grieving, we are desperate, we are probably collectively traumatized. Both sides are collectively traumatized. We are too. I lost people, dear people, on the 7th of October. And yet, to rise from the ashes, we need the kind of rationalism, moral rationalism, that Europe has always taken pride in creating and pursuing. So please, instead of demonizing one of the sides, oh, and I'm happy enough to demonize Hamas because Hamas is a demon, but never the Palestinians and not the Israelis. Please help us overcome our own extremists, our own hyper-nationalists, our own religious messianists, not to mention those of the other side. Help the moderates make peace. Thank you.
Me quedo con la última frase, help the moderate to make peace. Creo que hay que dar la palabra.
I think we have to give the floor to the General Director of UNRWA for him to explain us what UNRWA does. What is the situation he is facing, or they are facing? I know it. I wanted to express from the beginning all the support done by UNRWA. Without its help, the Palestine situation would be much worse. But now a bit concerned about what Fania has just mentioned, and I think that it is the right moment to explain what UNRWA does.
Tenemos la suerte de tener aquí a su director general, a su máximo responsable.
He is the general director, and be aware what is the privilege of having today with us the general director for UNRWA.
Thank you so much, High Representative. Thank you so much, Joseph Borrell, and thank you to the university for allowing me to speak today here in Saint-Nanterre. And let me also pay tribute to you, Mr. Borrell, for your moral leadership, but also your principal support to multilateralism. And being in Spain today, I would like also express a special gratitude to the people of Spain and to the government of Spain for their unwavering support to the Palestinians in the region and also to the agency. Maybe just before I start, I want to make one comment, but obviously we will be able to debate later on, which I have, while I agree 90% of what I heard before, I still have to disagree on an important point. I do not believe that the human development or humanitarian agency is an obstacle to peace. The obstacle to peace is the lack of political will to find a political solution. And we heard from the first, from Professor Finu, that in fact there have been a complacency for decades about the status quo and the containment policy. And basically, before October 7, the Israel-Palestinian conflict was not a priority anymore for the international community. And even domestically in Israel, where you have gone through 3, 4, 5 rounds of election, there haven't been any major political party having the resolution of the conflict in their political platform. So it was not a priority, and the obstacle to the two-state solution has been this absence of political will. And I really hope that the coalition of moderates that we are hearing today will make it a priority in the future after the seismic disaster which has taken place in the Middle East. I think it's impossible to overstate the impact of the horrible attack of October 7, not only on Israel, but also its consequences in Gaza. I think it's important for non-Israelis to understand that this attack has triggered a deep, deep national collective trauma within the Israeli society. And we could also feel that the shock and the horror of the attack have reverberated across Europe and beyond, and has also polarized our society and divided our society on the issue of Palestine and Israel. What we have seen just after October 7 has been that raw emotion have driven the Israeli military and political response, paving the way to a war conducted without restraint or regard for rules. We are 10 months later, still ongoing, and I have to say that Gaza is a place today which horrifies even the most seasoned humanitarian. No one in Gaza is spared, has been spared the misery and brutality. The strip has become unlivable, has been reduced to rubble. There is absolutely no safety to be found. People are just human pinballs, forced to be constantly on the move, and basically, on a daily basis, they are confronted with nothing else than death, disease, and hunger. And we have seen last week the staggering report about the number of people estimated killed, more than 40,000 people in 10 months, 14,000 people compared to a population of 2 million. This gives you, after that, the proportion if you compare to your own population. 10 months later, we hear, and we hear also from Professor Fani, I mean, the despair of the families. The hostages remain in captivities, and the families and friends are still trapped in a terrible limbo. But we also know that 10 months later, beyond the people killed, beyond the people mutilated, beyond the people who have been displaced, we have also thousands of people who have been detained in appalling conditions, subject to systematic abuse. We have, at the beginning of January, already revealed, including UNRWA staff, about the mistreatment in detention as, I would say, as early as in January. We have seen later on a number of reports being published, but the last one is the one from an Israeli NGO, B'Tselem, which published a report called Welcome to Hell, which basically has documented the grave abuses committed against the Palestinians in Israeli detention center since October 2023. And basically, you heard also the report about the sexual abuse at State Hyman, and B'Tselem spokesperson said this is nothing else than just the tip of the iceberg, and most of our colleagues call it much worse than what has already shocked the international community, the Abu Ghraib, a detention facility in Iraq. So the event on and after October 7 have definitely generated seismic changes, and I do believe, and I think it's an understatement for all of us, that we are living today in a dangerous and unpredictable environment. Not only dangerous because of the war in Gaza or the escalating tension in the region, but we heard it also before, because the rules-based international order that has been put in place since the end of World War II is at stake today, and it's being undermined. For example, the Geneva Convention, the moral compass of international humanitarian law, are challenged and at risk to become irrelevant. They were put in place 75 years ago with the aim to protect civilian and non-combatant during conflict. A set of rules that we all agreed. But do we still agree on this set of rules? Is this still the case? Member states have an obligation, not only those involved in the conflict, but any signatory of the Geneva Convention, which means that any European countries bilaterally have an obligation to make sure that this is fully endorsed. And despite all this day-to-day repeated violation, there is a remarkable reluctance within a large part of the international community to take any meaningful action to safeguard, in fact, the future of this agreed set of rules. Now, I want to speak a little bit about the attack against the United Nations and UNRWA. In Gaza, we have witnessed a blatant disregard for the United Nations, the personal premises and operation. We have more than 200 staff who have been killed. We have nearly 200 premises, school, health center, used to shelter people who have nowhere to go, which have been targeted and hit. Nearly 600 people seeking the refuge of the UN flag have been killed in these premises. We know that regularly, and here I want also to stress, that the UN and UNRWA, like the population in Gaza, has been asked to evacuate. We left North Gaza 2 weeks or 10 days after the beginning of the war under military instruction, which means we left all our premises. Since they have been regularly used by Palestinian Arab group, including Hamas, but also by the Israeli army. Our premises have not been respected anymore. And we have also seen regularly that convoys, which are coordinated, clearly marked, have been regularly, weekly, if not daily, targets of attack. But more broadly, the operational space in the occupied Palestinian territory is shrinking, not only for the United Nations, but also for international NGOs or anyone advocating for the compliance of international humanitarian law. We see today draft legislation in the Israeli parliament seeking to evict UNRWA from its premises of more than 70 years in East Jerusalem, to try to revoke its privileges and designate the agency as a terrorist organization. This would be absolutely unprecedented. A United Nations member state designating a United Nations agencies whose mandate is provided by the United Nations General Assembly designated a terrorist organization. Make absolutely no mistake. These are not just attacks against UNRWA. These are attacks against any individual, organization or country calling for adherence to international humanitarian law or promoting a peaceful political solution to this decade-long conflict. Since the war started, there have been no international journalist in Gaza. 10 months, no international journalist except those who have been embedded within the Israeli security forces. That's unheard. Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, journalists used to go and to report. Today, we have staff of international NGOs or UN entities. Anyone, many those involved in reporting, advocacy, or protection, they are phased out by the non-renewal of their visa. And these actions are now being extended to member states with a Norwegian diplomat prohibited to operate from the occupied Palestinian territory. So this attack on the UN, including UNRWA and the international community, are unprecedented in their scale and character. And I do believe that if allowed to continue, this attack will compromise humanitarian operations worldwide and erode the multilateralism and the rule of law. Others are watching. If we succeed there, it will be implemented elsewhere. And this is why it is so important for the EU and its member state to push back against attempt to designate a UN agency a terrorist organization, because failing to do so would set a new law standard and a dangerous precedent causing immense damage not only to the UN, but to the multilateral system at large. Now, just to go back, why does UNRWA exist? Let us have this step back. UNRWA was created 75 years ago as a temporary organization, a lasting temporary organization. But that shows also that in 75 years, we haven't found a lasting political solution to the question of Palestine. It's not because an agency exists that there is no solution. It's because there haven't been any political solution. Meanwhile, what does the agency do primarily? Primarily, we are providing basic education to more than 500,000 girls and boys in 700 schools across the region. And before October 7, we had 300,000 girls and boys in UNRWA school in Gaza. Today, all these girls and boys are living in the rubbles, are deeply traumatized. And the more we will wait to bring them back in an education environment, the more we will be sowing the seeds for more hatred and extremism in the future. If I look at our alumni are global citizens. We had former refugees in our school in Gaza who work now with NASA, who work in Spain contributing to pancreatic cancer. Or we had also a former refugee who is now in Austria and was part of the team developing the vaccine for COVID. Palestinians are proud of their education, and education is absolutely key for them because it's the only thing they haven't been yet dispossessed. All the rest has been taken, but not the education. And our schools are not what we keep hearing, brainwashing schools for future terrorists. In the contrary, we certainly have been the last barrier for that. We are the only one in the region having promoted and succeeded to have gender equality, we are the only one in the region having a proper human rights curriculum in our school. What's created the future terrorists are the repeated conflict, its brutality, and the absence of a future for these youth people. But we do also, beside education, we provide also primary health care, and on this we are very proud that we reach universal vaccination for the Palestinian refugees community. Sometimes our rate is better than in the United States or in some part of Europe. So I do believe that UNRWA in reality is not part of the problem. On the contrary, it has been a force for stability in the region. A force of stability until October 7, because today we cannot play this role the way we would like to play in Gaza. But UNRWA also, for the Palestinians in general, embodies the international commitment that we are still seeking a just and lasting political solution. When I started as Commissioner General, it was extraordinary to see that any attempt to change our service delivery model was perceived by the broader Palestinian community as the beginning of the dismantlement of the agency and possibly the expression of a total disinterest of the international community to continue to seek to promote a political solution. Now, the EU has been a partner of the agency since 1971. It's not just a financial partner, but it's also a political partner. And I have to say that the EU, together with its member states, are the main supporter of the agency. They represent also 60%, if not plus, of our resources. Now, let me turn to this highly, I would say, politicized and reputational challenge the agency is going through. As you know, we heard it before, we are constantly accused since October 7 of colluding with Hamas. I'm personally described as the other head of a terrorist organization. Which is also interesting, and ironically, this claim is often leveled against the agency by representative of a government that has for decades allowed and even facilitated the funding of Hamas from abroad, progressively reinforcing Hamas' hold in Gaza, and deliberately, and sometimes publicly assumed, with the aim to undermine the Palestinian Authority and thereby preventing to have any credible partner to negotiate a political solution and a two-state solution. On the other hand, Hamas constantly accuses the agency of collaborating with Israel and always also constantly attack our education system because we are promoting a human rights curriculum. So it's against this backdrop that we had this horrific allegation, which were shared with me in January, about staff who might have participated to the attack of October 7th. And we took this allegation, I took this allegation extremely seriously. Because of the context, I decided not only to terminate, but together with the contract, but together with the Secretary General, he decided an investigation behind all these allegations, and we have also decided a total review of the policy and risk management mechanism of the agency. When it comes to the investigation, in total, 19 staff have been accused of having participated to the massacre. 19 staff compared to our 33,000 staff in the region. Recently, the investigation came out and basically said up to the 19, if authenticated and corroborated, available evidence could indicate that 9 staff members may have been involved in the attack. There are far too many if. If it would be outside UNRWA, outside this type of environment, obviously there would not be enough proof. But in the interest of the agency, we have decided that this stuff, whether true or not true, but because of this indication, can no longer be staff of the agency. When it comes to the independent review on the risk management of the organization, which was led by former Minister of Foreign Affairs Catherine Colonna, I think many of you heard that, in fact, the agency has a system much more robust than anyone else in the region, but because of the highly politicized environment and because of the footprint of the organization, more can be done. There have been a number of recommendations for which we are fully committed to implement. Some of them can be implemented immediately by the agency. Others will require the support of member states, including of the government of Israel. Having said that, the campaign of misinformation, disinformation continue absolutely unabated. Now, what are the motivations behind the calls to dismantle the agency? I believe it is to strip the Palestinians from the refugee status, and hence to unilaterally change the parameter for a future political solution. UNRWA's very existence, and we heard it before, is an obstacle to those seeking to undermine the principle for resolving the Israel-Palestinian conflict pronounced by the General Assembly and the Security Council for decades. I think this approach and this belief is naive at best, and at best it is short-sighted. Even if UNRWA disappears, the refugee status of Palestinian refugees will remain. The status is not related to the services being provided to the Palestinian refugees. The status depends on a General Assembly resolution far before the creation of UNRWA, which called for the right of return to their home, or for those choosing not to return, for compensation for loss or damage to property. We were created by Resolution 302. What confers the Palestinian refugee status is Resolution 194. Now, I think we have alluded also a few times to the recent ICJ advisory decision. And I think this is also something very important that we will have collectively to digest and to translate into policies. What we know is that the International Court of Justice has found that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory remains an occupation. Palestinians in the OPT are living under conditions that violate Israel's international law obligation. And basically, this ruling talks about the settlement, its illegality, the transfer of settlers, the confiscation of land, the use of natural resources, the extension of Israeli domestic law to the occupied territories, the forced displacement of the Palestinians, and the policy of impunity on settler violence. The ICJ also was asked whether it is annexation or not. And basically, they said that the policies and practices are developed by Israel are designed to remain in place indefinitely and create irreversible effect on the ground. And lastly, the ICJ was asked, what about discrimination, segregation, and apartheid? And basically, its ruling said that the comprehensive restriction imposed on the Palestinian constitute systemic discrimination based on race, religion, or ethnic origin. And this is a violation. So what are the legal consequences for us, for all of us? I mean, for Israel, it's quite clear. They say that occupation has to come to an end, and Palestinians need to be compensated. We all know that the political solution aim also to this. So they restate the obvious, but through a legal lens. But what does it mean for us, members of the international community, the EU and its member states? That means the ruling asks that we have to respect the Palestinian right to self-determination, that we cannot recognize any change to the status or territorial integrity of the occupied territories since 1967, and that basically we have to make sure that this ruling be implemented. Even if it is not binding, it remains a reference for the international community. So I believe the EU and its member states have a responsibility to act, and where quiet diplomacy and public expression of concern and condemnation have failed to influence the Israeli government, different measures should be looked at. And I think also that the EU has leverage. And we heard from the first presenter that it's a question of will and determination. The EU has much more in its hands. For example, respect for human rights is an essential element of the EU association agreement with states. There is such an agreement also with the government of Israel. Substantive violation or violation of essential element could trigger a review. And the EU, economically, is one of the main partners of Israel. So let me conclude with one or two thoughts. It's an understatement to say the conflict in Gaza is untenable. But I fear that our humanitarian response, which is required to keep the Palestinian population alive, will result in us, the international community, becoming complicit in the crimes committed by Israel. We face an impossible dilemma, one that the conflict has placed us in, and that we were faced before, but never ever to this extent. Here, we have more legal and ethical issues that we must struggle to address together. We cannot become complicit of a new statu quo, just keeping people below the standard of human dignity. And this is an additional reason why, we need the ceasefire, unconditional release of the hostages, and real access to the people. And this is only a starting point. The transition from a ceasefire to the so-called day after will be long and excruciatingly difficult. And I do believe that safeguarding the role of UNRWA are the primary provider of education and primary healthcare is critical for a successful transition. There is no alternative on education except having a functioning administration and state to provide education at scope to 600,000 girls and boys. And the more we will wait, the more they will be brought up with a sense of hate and revenge. We definitely, and we heard it, Sociological cannot be an option anymore. Any political solution or package or roadmap needs to be time-bound. And this is the only way to bring Palestinian and Israeli to peace and security. But this is also the only way to fully implement the ruling of the International Court of Justice, and it's the only way to honor the intention of the international community expressed through the UN General Assembly and the Security Council. And again, if we fail to do this, we will increasingly become complicit in the action of the occupying power. I also think it's not just a mechanic political solution which is needed. This effort needs to be complemented by effort to counter the polarization and the dehumanization, not just in Israel and Palestine, but also in our own society. I personally experience this everywhere, including in my own country, Switzerland. The conflict in Gaza has revealed a highly concerning deficit of mutual empathy. It will be impossible to move forward if we cannot recognize and value the humanity of both Palestinian and Israeli equally. No life is worth more than the other one. But this, unfortunately, is a concept which seems to be hard to understand. Losing our empathy is very dangerous. It cannot be a geometry variable. It cannot be a double standard. If we do this, it's like if we are losing part of our humanity. So I think what is at stake is our international solidarity and commitment vis-à-vis shared value. And more than ever, we have a role to play. States have a role to play. Civil society has a role to play. We need to recommit to multilateralism and to its institution. We heard before coalition of moderate, I don't know how to name it, but we have to make sure that what came out from World War II still remains, because the world, more than ever, needs it today. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Thank you to the responsible for. Is it still the U.S. Congress blocking the funding to UNRWA?
Yes, of course. The only one.
Is
the only remains.
Is the only one that still says no funding to UNRWA? On the other hand, some high-level officials of the U.S. government encourage us to support UNRWA, saying I cannot do it because the Congress forbid it, but please try to do it. And we try to do it. Well, let's see the voice of a sociologist, a political analyst that can talk about the views of the Israeli societies and complement the view of Fania. Talia, please.
Good morning. Thank you so much to High Representative, Vice President Borrell, for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you to my colleagues. The disadvantage of going last is that I would like to jump in and respond to a lot of these points, which are really critical. I've been typing because I keep learning a great deal from what has been said so far. It is an honor to be here, despite the fact that I have very little good to say. But I will try to give insights about the Israeli public. I want to put it in a couple of contexts. I'm going to try to give you insights from survey research, which is a lot of, great deal of what I do. I want to put it in the context of what I consider, what I might call horizontal dynamics, so Israeli public attitudes and Palestinian public attitudes, because I don't think we can afford, or I don't think we should allow ourselves anymore to look at these two populations in isolation of one another. They are sharing the land. Their fates are interdependent. They are not separable. Political resolutions notwithstanding, we can talk about the framework of a political resolution, but the two people are and have been and will be interdependent, and I think we need to understand each other better. So I have increasingly don't feel like it's reflective of reality to look at one side without looking at the other, also because we don't have a Palestinian representing them here. But the other reason is that I also work on public opinion research among Palestinians as well, with Palestinian colleagues, and so I am inside the question of how Palestinians feel in addition. I want to also try to put this into longitudinal context. So after looking at this in terms of the two populations, I'll give you a little bit of background about how attitudes have changed a little bit over the course of the war, but really over the course of the last few decades, historic trends. I've been conducting polls for 25 years, and of course I know about public opinion trends going back further. And then I'll try to end with looking at what I see as the role of the public, what are the opportunities but limitations, and of course, hopefully have some insights about the role of the EU from the Israeli perspective. Let me start with difficult observations about Israeli society. And I'm not going to throw too many numbers at you. You can be grateful that I didn't bring a slide presentation, but I'll give you the general insights. For one thing, you have to realize that, despite, what Fania has said, which I understand, the political analysis, that there is a moderate group that is, 30 to 50% of society. The fact is, when it comes to this war, the vast majority of the Jewish Israeli population believes the war is justified. I have to distinguish because, of course, the Arab citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel have completely opposite perspective on the war. And so these are also part of the Israeli citizen body, and we have to distinguish them because they have very little in common on this issue. The great feeling is of justification. We have surveys showing over 80% of Israeli Jews believe the war is justified. There is a notable lack of empathy for the civilians of Gaza. At points we have, actually most surveys are showing a moderate majority, but not a huge majority, but oftentimes a majority who are opposed to humanitarian aid in Gaza. They think the amount of force that Israel has used is justified, or many people think that it should be more forceful. In terms of how Israelis think about what will be the endgame of the war, we have surveys. I'll give you a couple of numbers from the Israel's INSS think tank, which found that this is a recent survey just published a couple days ago, that 78% of Israelis think that Israel will win the war, 80% think that it will achieve its aims in the war. But at the same time, we have a parallel and somewhat mitigating, very strong and consistent trend in Israeli society. So you have high support for the war, a great desire for the war to achieve its aims. But only 30% think the aims of the war are clear. 30% of all Israelis, that's just a minority, don't understand what the aims of the war are. And there's a very clear reason for that. They don't understand and they don't trust the leader of the country, Prime Minister. In the same survey that I just mentioned, only 30% trust the Prime Minister. The survey that I mentioned where only 30% think the aims of the war are clear is from May, that's from Tel Aviv University. And as a result, this combination of Israelis having profound distrust in their leadership, profound lack of understanding of where the war is going, before I even open up the fact that a majority would support suspending the war or ending the war entirely for hostage release. And the surveys are very consistent on that. But as a result, the great outlook in Israeli society now, if you look at surveys, and you don't need to be a public opinion researcher, you can just talk to people on the street, is very, very dire. The portion of Israelis who recently told survey researchers at the Israel Democracy Institute that the country is going in the wrong direction is 63%, unprecedented high. The portion who feel optimistic about security is at a low point, lower than I have ever seen it in my, in my years of working on public opinion, down to 26%. Just 1/4 of Israelis feel that their security is likely to get better. And at the same time, there's a third trend that I think is hard to quantify by survey research. It's something that we observe if you live in Israeli society and if you listen and you watch the Israeli media and talk to people. And I think it explains some of these first two dynamics that I mentioned. A, the high support for the war. B, the lack of empathy as part of that, but alongside that, deep distrust in the aims of the war, the future, and the leadership. The third thing that I identify, unrelated to surveys, is a very profoundly introverted view. Israelis are, in a sense of, feeling a very strong sense of desperation, existential threat, ongoing trauma. There's the trauma from October 7th, the daily additional trauma of people who are displaced, who are suffering from rocket fire, who are losing people every day, right? Soldiers who are being killed. And so the constant feeling is one of profound uncertainty, and people are constantly busy thinking about themselves, thinking about what's going on in the country. They do not have additional room to spare. Certainly not for Palestinians, this is the reality, and certainly not for understanding the rest of the world, other than to, be kind of uncritically adopting the narrative of the Israeli government and very often the media that the entire world is against Israel, and so that is taken as an article of faith. But I think it's the internal looking form of Israeli thinking right now that is driving a lot of this and is a symptom and also a source of danger in the future. At the same time, of course, there is the protest movement, which I believe Fania mentioned, and it's interesting that despite everything I just said, it's quite active. In a time of war, and we're not talking about just dozens of people, we're talking about, what drives me crazy is when the Israeli media reports on them as thousands of people. I'm going to these protests, they're not thousands of people, they're tens of thousands of people, which is a continuation of anti-government protests in support of democracy and against the judicial reforms of the previous year. They themselves were a continuation of protests against the Netanyahu government. Increasingly, I have started to call it the Netanyahu regime. But those same protesters have joined up in the cause of supporting hostage release, which is associated with ending the war. So let's be clear, these are not anti-war protests. They are not protests for peace and love and humanitarian assistance, but they are protests that indirectly support ceasefire, even a permanent ceasefire, because people are prioritizing hostage release and do not trust that the government is continuing this war for the good of the country, but they believe the government is continuing the war to perpetuate its own political self-interest, particularly Netanyahu. Let me give you the lateral analysis, because this is a very difficult analysis of Israeli society. If you look at Palestinians, you have to understand that there on numerous measures, there is a mirror image of very, very negative attitudes. And I have to also be clear, I'll talk about the history, but it didn't start with the war. So I don't want to suggest that the Palestinian experience is parallel. This is not a both sides situation. There is an occupier, there is an occupied. There is a country that has vastly more political, economic, and military power. But if you look at some of the public dynamics, it's uncanny, actually, how similar they are. So, for example, when we look at support for October 7th and the most recent survey from Palestinian survey research company that I work with, Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, from May and June, 2/3 support Hamas's decision to do the attack on October 7th. That support has been a majority the entire time. And trust me, if there's one data point that Israelis have ever heard from Palestinian public opinion, it's that one. It has been even higher in the past. 90% don't believe that there were atrocities committed on October 7th. When asked about their satisfaction with performance levels of different actors during the war, 75% say give Hamas a rating of satisfied or very satisfied. This is just an example. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I do think it's, if we want to understand these societies, for every accusation that Israel makes against Palestinians, Palestinians can make against Israelis in terms of how they think. And for every accusation we can make about Israelis in terms of how the people are thinking and how little empathy they have and how much they're supporting this war, you have a parallel process on the Palestinian side. It's really, when you work among both publics, it can become like a loop. You really see how these are self-reinforcing. Let me give you some of the historic trends, what I'm calling longitudinal trends. At present, you have only a minority of Israelis or Palestinians who support a two-state solution. Resolution of the conflict based on the establishment of two states living side by side along the 1967 borders. And I've been conducting, asking this question for, again, 25 years, but actually really only a little over 20 years, because before that, before the early 2000s, we weren't asking about the question of a two-state solution because the concept didn't really exist. We forget that it's kind of new. We talked about a Palestinian state, maybe. But in any case, I can tell you that, back in the early 1990s, only a minority of Israelis supported it. It was considered, a great gift to the PLO. But over the 1990s and the 2000s, support went up. Palestinians supported it. By the time of, let's go back just to 2010, you have a robust majority among both Israelis and among Palestinians for the concept of a two-state solution. It was considered the paradigm. 70% of Israelis supported it. 57% of Palestinians supported it, at least in the particular survey project that I'm talking about, which is a joint survey project. If you look at the graph, which I have not brought, but you can imagine it because it's very simple. Support over the course from 2010 through to the present has been declining incrementally and steadily throughout the decade. Both sides lost the majority of support for a two-state solution around 2018. We can talk about exactly why, but the politics were pretty clear. As my colleagues have pointed out, the issue was off the agenda. International actors were not paying attention to it. The Trump administration was doing everything to support Israel's strengthening its position in perpetuating occupation, but also annexation. And Palestinians felt particularly hopeless, and Israelis felt that they no longer had to deal with this remote concept of a two-state solution that they were never going to get to. I also think that we can attribute the increasing hardening attitudes over time to the fact that we forget, but there were 4 or 5, depends on how you count, 4 wars in Gaza between Israel and Hamas from 2009, or late 2008, through to before the current war. It depends on how you count each particular operation. Let me put this in a basic way. War is not good for peace. Every time we had an escalation with Gaza, all attitudes became hardened on both sides. Palestinians showed more support for Hamas after every such round. Israelis showed more support for very militant attitudes, and all of them showed less support for the two-state solution. At present, those attitudes have gotten worse among Israelis. So after October 7th, right away, we saw even a further drop in support for the two-state solution. Again, I have to distinguish between the Jewish and the Palestinian citizens of Israel because they are very different. Palestinian citizens of Israel, bless them, they are always showing a majority of support for the two-state solution. They are the only ones that have a majority of support for this solution between the river and the sea. Among Palestinians, support is still at about 1/3, depending on the survey. Among Israeli Jews, we have support going down to about 1/4, even a little bit lower in a survey that I have conducted, but it's not yet public. So,
what is the difference between Israel and Israeli Jews?
Israeli citizens include Jews and Palestinian citizens. 20% are Palestinian citizens. We survey them as Israelis, but I distinguish them from Palestinians living under occupation in West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Okay. So Jews are 73% of Israeli society, and we analyze them separately where they have major differences. Where they have overlapping attitudes, I just call everybody Israelis. Let me say that I advocate that anybody who is an Israeli citizen understands that you can be an Israeli citizen without being Jewish. Okay? Let me also give another, one of the changes that have taken place over time. I would say from the 1990s roughly, we had somewhat more of an even division between people who identified themselves as left-wing, right-wing, and centrist. There were already more right-wingers by self-definition in survey research in the 1990s, but it was, more parity. And the question of left, right, or center is obviously not the same as it is in the US or in Europe. It's not about immigration or anti-immigration. It's not about big government or taxes. It's almost exclusively about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Jewish-Arab identity issues, nationalism, etc. And I say this based on my analysis of surveys over the years, not just from my feeling about it. At present, I can say that it's a major change over time, because if these ideological groups were once a little more evenly divided, what we have now is over 60% of Israeli Jews among the Jewish population who self-identify as right-wing, okay? About 25% who identify as centrist, and I will explain what that means, and about 11 or 12% who identify as left-wing, okay? So you have a very, very weighted public sentiment in favor of right-wing attitudes. This has, as I've argued, the left-right-center division is primarily the predictor of how people feel about the conflict. And so just to give you one example of how that has changed attitudes on the conflict, throughout almost all of our Israeli-Palestinian joint survey research, we have seen that, for the most part, the two-state solution, even though it was losing its majority, was still the preferred solution, as opposed to any other solution, including one democratic state, or annexation and an unequal state. That has been reversed now. The reversal began a few years ago, but ultimately what we have now is that among Israeli Jews, the greater portion, the plurality, support annexation of all the territories with limited rights for Palestinians, or what you might call a single Jewish-dominated unequal state. So this is a manifestation of what happens when people are far more ideologically oriented towards the right wing. Now, these changes sound like bad news, right? If you are supporting peace through a two-state solution. Of course, if you're supporting, Jewish annexation, then it's good news. But let's establish the starting point. However, I would like us to also consider that there is some good news in these changes. These changes did not take place in an arbitrary way. Each of the sort of watershed or benchmark points where public attitudes were changing were in response to developments on the ground, in response to leadership actions. Of course, on the Israeli side, the leadership is elected, and in the past, there have been Palestinian elections. So there's a self-reinforcing cycle between the public and the leadership, but this is very much in response to how the conflict has evolved, which means that if it has changed in this direction in recent decades, it can also change into a different direction. That will take leadership, okay? And this is where I want to move into, a final section where I'd like to talk about what we can expect from the public and what we can expect from outside actors in general and the EU in particular, and where this can go. I think we have to acknowledge that these attitudes among the Israeli and Palestinian public are extremely negative in terms of contributing to peace right now, and I don't expect them to change in an arbitrary way. They never change from arbitrary ways. I don't think we can expect the public to drive movements towards peace. Of course, that doesn't mean that the public should not try, right? Fania talked about being representative of Israeli peace-supporting civil society. It's critical. I think it's even, in a way ironic that these ongoing decades of occupation and conflict have driven Israeli society and Palestinian society to have fairly robust civil society activities. And that's why we see these protests on the street that are able to continue even in the face of the war. And I should say, there are very small but very committed anti-war protesters, even now. They're anti-occupation protesters, and they are mingling among the bigger protests, so people sort of know that they are part of the conversation. But the fact is that, the vast majority of Israelis, we cannot have an illusion. They are living in such a state, they are consumed by anxiety, uncertainty, preparation for new every day. It feels like every day or every week, we have some unprecedented situation that we don't know how to cope with, including now the possibility of a complete regional escalation. Nobody knows where that would end. Complete regional escalation, or maybe just with Hezbollah. But a war just with Hezbollah would be so devastating that nobody knows how to cope with it. People are reliving their traumas. I said this in the beginning. They are not about to drive a peace movement with the side of the conflict that has, been an aggressor as well on October 7th, and it's not going to happen. I do think that change will have to start from the top. Okay, we need leadership that will drive this. It's a very long road because the current Israeli leadership will not. They don't want to. We need to obviously acknowledge that. However, there are movements in Israel that are better placed, larger portions of the population who are critical of the government and who are mobilizing to change the government. Now, again, when Fania mentioned that there will be a new government that is center, left-leaning, and pragmatic, I think that it is a very, very dicey prospect. We have no idea. Difficult to predict. I think it is difficult to predict because of what I'm seeing in public opinion dynamics, including some recovery of support for the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Every time the regional escalation gets worse, his support gets higher. Some recovery of support for his government. There's a fragmented opposition, and there is no guarantee, I think, that we will have necessarily a center, certainly not I personally don't think there's going to be a center-left government next. There may be, if anything, a more pragmatic, right-oriented government, but it's no way to predict right now. Of course, if there is any government other than the current one, that will be much more of an opportunity for international actors to have much more of an influence because that kind of a government would be more attentive to it. But we can expect that the only major change to come from the public in Israel might be towards supporting a different kind of government. And regarding the European Union and outside actors in general, I do think that with relation to the Israeli public, there is an important but limited role. For the reasons I said, I don't think the source of change right now is going to come directly from the public. I do think the EU needs to be thinking much more strategically about how to work with decision makers, and not to give up, whatever policies can be used to try to push the current Israeli government because it may win again, but also consider what kinds of opportunities could be realistic for having an impact on the policy, the language, the ideas of the next government, especially if the next government is what I might call a pragmatic right-wing government, which I think is much more likely, to be honest. It's the pragmatic right-wing, which Israelis see them as pragmatic right-wing, that is doing better right now than other parties. And you need to think about the opportunities for addressing decision makers, using leverage in ways that are maybe, there's no good answer to this, but I think that the EU has this leverage. The question is, will it use it? America has leverage. The question is whether it will use it. And that leverage can be directed, it might not always be in the form of big public rhetoric addressed at the top leadership, which Israelis very quickly turn against the EU. Very quickly, they just brush it off. It's anti-Israel, it's anti-Semitic, it's singling out. Maybe it can be addressed to different levels of government, quieter levels of government, where it doesn't make as big headlines, not because it's secret, but because it impacts different areas of governance and economy and trade, where the EU has enormous leverage, and where you can have leaders of those communities who may not even be politically oriented towards where Fania is, and frankly myself, but will realize how much this has an impact on the different sectors. And the Israeli public is not likely to enjoy this and appreciate it. Don't expect to be loved for it. This could take the form of trade pressure, targeted sanctions against extremist settlers, of course, as the Americans have done and you have called for. Violations of international law, I think, have an increased basis for response based on the ICJ ruling that we've spoken about. But that has to be incorporated with the reality that this will be seen as one-sided. It will be. There's no question that Israeli society reflexively will make the accusations that I said. I personally disagree with them, but that doesn't matter. They will not be dispelled very quickly, and therefore I do think that there has to be a role for addressing Palestinian society as well. Like I said, I don't think we can really ever look at these two societies in isolation. And I think the biggest critique I have for how the international community, including the best-meaning supporters of a two-state solution, the real critique I have is looking at Palestinians as passive actors. They are not passive actors, not in war. They know how to undertake aggressive action, and not in peacemaking, and not in democracy. You mentioned it. We need institutions in order to reconstruct Palestinian life when this is over on some level. Institutions are needed to build an economy. There needs to be support for the voices who are critical of Hamas. And in general, I think the European Union can speak more clearly against the aggressive actors in this situation, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah. This needs to be named, not in order to make it symmetrical, not in order to pretend that the power dynamics are not what they are, but the reality is that without, some evidence to Israelis, so that people like me can make the case, those things have to be named as well. And I think the EU also needs to support democracy, again, institution building, et cetera, for Palestinians. For Israel, let me just say, we are on the issue. Israeli democracy is, I would say, in a very severe risk of collapse. And the reason why it's at very severe risk of collapse is because it was never strong enough from its foundations. The foundations way before the Netanyahu government were never strong enough, or they were missing critical pieces. And the problem is that I don't want to encourage the EU to lecture Israel about their democratic practice, because it will simply be a tool in the hands of the right-wing government to say, oh, these people who are against us are now telling us about democracy. But be aware that Israel is equally at risk. Palestinians may be at risk of not being able to build those institutions or reconstruct democratic governance, but that is the standard they should be held to. And finally, I think that in such a hopeless time, there is some hope, and that is you, the European Union itself. Why do I say that? Because this can't only be a matter of telling us what to do, but bringing the example of the European Union. Okay, we forget that after World War II, the European Union not only was created, which I think is a miracle in itself, to be honest, but was one of the reasons why Europe has not descended once again into war. And only a few years after, nobody can compare nobody could diminish the horrors of what happened in Europe during that time. I think that it is worth making the case in a positive way as well. If I can take a page from the American presidential campaigns going on right now, the biggest difference between the campaign now for Kamala Harris and the Democrats against Trump is that the Democratic campaign has now transformed into a positive-oriented campaign. We need a little bit of that in the region. Show us what it meant to transform Europe. Show us the mechanisms that were used to do it. Show us what peace through partnership between countries actually looks like, even sharing certain aspects of sovereignty. This opens up new visions beyond the traditional two-state solution based on walls, false separation, which can never really be the case, because even if we try to ethnically divide our populations, we are mixed. Israeli society has 20% Palestinians. We are interdependent in terms of climate, environment, resources, diseases, polio. You cannot separate the interdependence. We need to open up what a two-state solution actually means in terms of cutting one another off and think about it based on built-in partnership. I want to hear the realistic case. You talked about the failures of realism. I think it is unrealistic to be wedded to particular manifestations of a two-state solution from 25 years ago, when the opportunities are no longer there. Please make this the case, or at least explain to us how countries have come together, opened their borders, recognized their interdependence, built mechanisms for partnership, shared resources, opportunities, economic opportunities, which require minimum of shared values to sustain those partnerships. This would be a future that our people can begin to hope for. Thank you.
Thank you. Some data has been important to know. At the moment in the time, if I understood you well, at the moment in the time, 70% of the public opinion in Israel was supporting the two-state solution.
Yeah, only in 2010. Wasn't that long ago. And you had a majority on both sides until 2018.
2010, and then it decreased until 30% in Israel. I don't know.
About a third among Palestinians.
1/3, and I don't know how many in the Palestinian side.
About 1/3 of Palestinians.
About 1/3 also. Well, can you go deeper to the analysis of why this happened?
Yes.
Because this is a change that we are not aware. Because we listen so many times to Netanyahu government, refusing the two-state solution, saying, no, 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 never, it will never happen, and I am here to prevent it from happening. That at the end, we believe that ever, the Israeli society was against it. Ever, forever. It has never been in favor. And you tell us that not so far away, 10 years, 15 years ago, 70% of the population was in favor. So why we didn't use this opportunity and we went through? And by the contrary, we withdrew to the 30%.
Should I?
Yes.
I mean, why you didn't use this opportunity? Listen, let's be a little bit humble. If the leadership of the region is so resistant to doing it, I don't think, even the mighty United States couldn't do it or wasn't. But I do think that if I can characterize what I said before, there is leverage of the US and the EU that is not being used. Neither of them are using their very material leverage in ways that they could. Now, we all know the limitations. I don't need to analyze for you why the European Union is limited in terms of using that leverage, of course, the US, but outside actors can't only talk about supporting it, they have to be able to take actions. I think it took international actors a long time to realize that the Israeli leadership under Netanyahu in particular had no intention of reaching a two-state solution. Maybe because Netanyahu gave a speech in 2009 when he said, well, maybe under the right conditions, we would allow a certain kind of Palestinian state, and people saw what they wanted to see. So I'm very careful about judging observers in hindsight. You should have known. But let's face it, it has been his lifelong project to undermine the possibility of a Palestinian state. He has two lifelong projects, mobilizing around Iran and highlighting that Iran is the biggest danger to the world, and undermining the Palestinian national cause, and laying the groundwork for Israeli annexation, at least of the West Bank. So I know that people will say, but he doesn't really have an ideology, he just wants to stay in power. I don't agree, I don't buy it, I don't care. He is in power, he has laid the groundwork for complete destruction of the Palestinian national cause, and he has tried to translate that into policy. He has translated it into policy, and I should say with some partial success, because at a certain point, you were asking about 2010, by 2015, certainly 2016, when the Trump administration came around and showered gifts on Israel, gifts that also undermine the entire international system. When a country recognizes another country's annexation, sovereignty over territorial annexation, that is a violation of the UN Charter. The UN Charter doesn't just prohibit annexation, it prohibits other countries from recognizing, or the meaning of the UN Charter. And this is what the Trump administration did, both with relation to the Golan Heights, but also with relation to settlements, by saying that they were not a violation of international law. So I think that what happened over time is that the Israeli government said, we've been successful. We have taken the issue off the agenda. We have waited. We have drawn out the time sufficiently until we got a president who was willing to basically formalize the situation, which carries enormous weight right around the world. And we have learned how to manage the violence. This is what Netanyahu thought and what he tried to do in his policy. You have some forms of violence, occasional escalations, but you have an air defense system and a manageable level of risk. And Israel became an increasingly integrated player in global affairs, expanding its foreign relations, being an economic, tremendous economic success, joining all the international organizations it needed. Now, please don't take from my words that I think that the next thing that should be done is that Israel should be expelled from all those organizations or face a full-out boycott. This is not what I'm suggesting, but I do think that it became much harder over the years to claim that the occupation was not sustainable. It became very sustainable until the day it wasn't. And the reality, and the sad reality that I don't want to take up the time from my other colleagues, is that while negotiations were failing, while the Palestinian Authority was going to the UN and saying, accept us as a member state, or maybe there were popular demonstrations or boycott movements, which, as an Israeli, I don't like them, but I think they're legitimate nonviolent forms of political expression and action. While Palestinians were trying numerous nonviolent means, nothing except violence ever got the attention of the world again. And so on October 7th, when the vast majority of Palestinians say, Hamas put Palestine and Gaza back on the global agenda, they're right. And I think that this ongoing, compromising of international law, weakening of the international system. I would love to, talk more about Russia and Ukraine, but I think that was a major turning point where it empowers, this long-term undermining empowers people like Putin to say this international system is a farce. I can do what I want. So, sorry.
Do you have another explanation?
Yes, just echoing what has just been said by my distinguished colleague, acts matters, actions matters. In 2010, when you had the climax of popular support for the two-state solution, both in the Israeli and the Palestinian public opinion, you even had Barack Obama saying in front of the General Assembly of the UN, I hope next year we can see a new member state, Palestine. But 2010 was also when EU decided to disconnect the association agreement with Israel from actual progress on the peace process. To say we will address the association agreement, see how it works, see how cooperation is fruitful, without addressing at the same time, which was the case before, the continuous progress of the settlements and the dispossession, the multifaceted dispossession of the Palestinian people. So, as you all know, Obama turned also his back on the peace process by vetoing the possibility of admitting Palestine to the United Nations, which was a great strike against the credibility of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. And EU went on doing business and cooperation with Europe without taking the settlement into consideration. Then came the big Iran craze. Oh, there's only one problem in the Middle East. This is the Iran nuclear bomb. Forget Palestine, forget Syria, of course. You can have 500,000 killed people in Syria. We will just focus on the Iranian deal, which was the epitome of what Benjamin Netanyahu had been saying for years. Before he was saying it is Iraq, then he said it is Iran. But the issue is always there is a nuclear power in the making somewhere in the Middle East that makes everything related to Palestine secondary or dispensable. And everybody fell into the trap. And I remember, when there was all this hype about the nuclear deal in 2015, and I was forced to say on various media, listen, I'm a peacenik, I love peace, I love diplomacy, but this is a sham. It's another pipe dream. It won't solve anything. And we saw not only didn't solve the very issue, but it brought Russia deeper in Syria, and it made the Netanyahu-Putin nexus even stronger. And then came the second blow, and the blow was Trump. The blow was Trump smashing everything basic about international law in the Middle East, and the recognition of Jerusalem as capital of Israel. He didn't realize, because I'm not sure he's very aware of history, but it happened just 100 years, 1 century nearly to the day after the Balfour Declaration. And in the two texts, the Trump Declaration and the Balfour Declaration, the Arab identity of the Palestinian people, the Arab identity of Palestinian territory is totally wiped out. So then, of course, you can come with the Golden Age, with the settlements, the worst is done. And Biden never came back on that. So if you don't go back to the basic issues, if you don't recall the principles, an occupied territory is occupied, and occupation is illegal, then of course everything is possible. And in 2018 in Gaza, you had a chance by the civil society to challenge Hamas' military option. It was the so-called marches of return, and they were repressed ruthlessly with thousands of maimed citizens that were not militants. Then the movement was infiltrated by militants. And the worst bloodbath occurred on the very inauguration of the US Embassy in Jerusalem in front of not only Trump's daughter and Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Trump, but also blessed. You have to take into account that Americans bless their embassies, and the embassy was blessed by two famous representatives of the Christian Zionist messianic trends that happened to be well-known anti-Semites. So all this, of course, 2018, everybody started to say it's a new era, it's Trump, who will have the Abraham Accords until, of course, the terrific, horrendous bloodbath of October 7. Conflicts that are not resolved always explode one way or another. This is a basic rule of international law and of world history. There's no alternative to peace except eternal war.
Yes, I remember when I came to office, I found that Israel-Palestine conflict was not in the agenda, and I try to put it in the agenda. And I try. I remember many of my staff people telling me, "Oh, High Representative, don't lose your time. Don't lose your time. It is a completely impossible thing to solve. Many have tried and they failed. So don't use your time or political energy engaging on trying to take the Palestinian and Israeli peace process alive." At the end, they told me, things are quiet. Things go well. Nothing happens there. And look, the Arabs are making peace with Israel, and they will spill over and affect the Palestinians positively. But things are calm. And anyway, they will not be able to do anything about it. And it has never been so calm. Even Sullivan, some days before the Hamas attack, was saying, the Middle East has never been so peaceful, so quiet as today. So why to bother? And I remember my first action as High Representative. I still was not in office, but I was going to be in office in New York during the UNRWA meeting in 2019. End of September, I had the opportunity of having dinner with Mr. Kushner, and he explained me his plans. And he told me, politician has failed, now a businessman will solve it. I am a businessman, I know how to make deals. And when he showed me his plan, I said, well, it's not going to fly, the Palestinians will never accept it. Oh, yes, because they will never have a better offer. And then he presented his plan, the plan was not accepted, and unhappily, dramatically, the issue has come back to the agenda of the international community because of the horrendous attack of Hamas and the answer of Israel. And now it's very high in the agenda, but frankly speaking, the European Union has shown such a great division in front of this problem that it's difficult for us to be, apart from humanitarian support, in which we are doing well, we are the good Samaritans, the ones who come and support people in need. But this is not a solution. This is a way of trying to take care of people suffering. But why are they suffering? No? We talk about the Gaza as it was a natural disaster, no? A flood or a earthquake. No? It's not a flood, it's not a earthquake, it's a man-made disaster. And we are feeding people tonight in order to be killed tomorrow. So it's not a great solution. I am going to give the floor to all of you. To you, Fania, you want to react, to make some comments, and then to you. I think that this is a good occasion to interact between people who have different approaches to such a difficult problem. Please, Fania.
Thank you very much. This has been fascinating, and I'm grateful to every member of this panel for making such interesting points. I will start with the negative and then move on to the future and to what might be able to transpire if we try very hard. In regard to the absence of forces of peace and their withdrawal over the last decade and a half until the 7th of October, I can only agree that it was a dire mistake by the EU and its leadership. And I can only agree that it was a dire mistake on part of Barack Obama. And by the time Trump took over, Israel was, under Netanyahu, of course, flown all the way back to a kind of unrealistic euphoria like the one that we went through after the Six-Day War. But yes, history does matter. And I want to say something about the rise of the extreme right also in Europe. This has to be mentioned here. And a word about Zionism. First, about the extreme right. Israel has many false friends. Donald Trump and his previous administration, and I hope not his future administration, I hope that Kamala Harris would be able to enter the fray in a positive and assertive way. But Donald Trump has been no friend to Israel. And the far-right European parties which have gained ground in the recent elections and are gaining ground in several European countries are no true friends of Israel. And I'm talking about Geert Wilders and Marine Le Pen and the others. They are not our friends. They represent an agenda which is anti-Muslim far more than so-called pro-Israel. And no anti-Muslim agenda is good for Israel. No Islamophobia is good for Israel. It's almost as bad as anti-Semitism in the sense that it deepens the abyss rather than beginning to fill it out and to create a common ground. So this has to be said as clearly as possible to the Europeans and to the EU. And of course, to many Israelis who are still fed by the narrative that the extreme European and American right are good for us. They are not. Our true friends are those who recognize the history of Israel, know some of the facts. Very few people online do these days. Understand the raison d'etre of Israel, including the Balfour Declaration, which failed to mention the Palestinians or the Arabs of the land in that time. And of course, including the United Nations Resolution 101 of November 2047. Early Zionism accepted the notion of a liberal democratic state of Jews and Arabs, that is Herzl, equal rights, equal civic standing. And by 1947, Zionist Israeli leadership, Ben-Gurion and his government in making, immediately accepted the United States Nations Resolution 101 for two countries, an Israel and a Palestine. So when Dalia Scheindlin, in her very informative presentation, really eye-opening in many respects, surprised some of you by saying that as recently as 2010, there was a 70% majority of Israelis for the two-state solution. There was almost a similar percent in the early 90s when Yitzhak Rabin was elected and brought to power by a landslide majority. And this was his agenda, of course, the Oslo Agreement. And there was a sweeping majority back in 1947 when Israel accepted the very first, the earliest two-state solution. So we need to acknowledge the fact that many people today, maybe not in this room, maybe there are a few, I don't know, think that Israel should not have been created in the first place and consequently has no right to exist today. We need to face up to these people as much as we face up to the extreme right in Europe and America and to Israel's false friends there. we need the moderate, liberal range of European and Americans to help us out. Zionism, initially, what I call humanist Zionism, was only the core belief. Everything else was an addition, a decoration. There were debates about it. But the core belief was simply that the Jewish people are entitled to a country of their own, a liberal democracy by the Zionist sides, in part of their ancestral homeland, with full rights to its Arab citizens and the possibility of a neighboring Palestinian state as of 47 onwards. Now, there were many Israeli leaders who did not live up to this standard. There are recent Israeli leaders who have distorted Zionism no end. We are now fighting to reclaim Zionism on its minimalist, humanist, globalist, law-abiding hub of ideas, to reclaim it to the center left and to the moderates. So this is about Zionism, and I'm not going to stop using the word because I believe that a Jewish state, which is a liberal democracy and lives in peace with its neighbors, is necessary and just. And finally, maybe one thing about Israeli civil society on which I disagree with Dalia Scheindlin's excellent presentation. Dalia says that the good players, the good global players, the EU, the European countries, the United States, if it continues to be ruled by the Democrats, ought to put pressure on Israeli officials and leaders, and I fully accept that. This is true. But it must not forget Israeli civil society, by which I mean the Jewish left and the Arab left and the center. And yes, Dalia, also the moderate right. There is a moderate right. It may be rising in power now. People like Naftali Bennett. And this moderate right, perhaps Gidon Saar, it is still very hawkish in terms of thinking of a Palestinian state, but could be moved in that direction because they are rational people, because they are not messianists and they are not religious and nationalist fanatics. Civil society is the only force in Israel that can bring these moderate leaders to power. And the problem civil society is facing, yes, we trust the EU to it. We will trust the future, hopefully democratic administration to it. We will no longer trust the United Nations. Not after many years of hundreds of Security Council decisions against Israel, hundreds, and less than 10 such decisions against North Korea, Iran, Russia. And certainly not UNRWA. I'm sorry, you know, this is, there is something wrong in the fact that the Israeli peace camp, which still exists, and democracy camp, which is impressive, cannot trust an organization that has so lined up with Hamas and Hamas's intention without going into the numbers of actual UNRWA employees. By the way, Mr. Lazzarini forgot to mention the UNRWA paid doctor and teacher who held Israeli hostages in their own private homes. We know that, we have the testimonies. But these are anecdotes, perhaps. A main point which is not an anecdote to me, and I have to put it here, it's not an easy or comfortable point to make. And it's very, very sad. I believe the Gaza Ministry of Health, which is Hamas-led, of course, the Hamas Ministry of Health, that 40,000 Gazans were killed since the 7th of October. And my heart goes out, and I have a sense of collective shame and even personal shame and sadness and heaviness that I'll take to my grave for 25,000 out of those 40,000 Gazans. Because those 25,000 are the innocent victims, women and children and men and the elderly, the mirror picture of the Israelis massacred on the 7th of October. However, 15,000 of those, according to the Israeli government and army, which I have no reason to disbelieve more than I disbelieve the Gaza Ministry of Health, or to believe, claim that 15,000 of these people were Hamas and Islamic Jihad combatants, hence terrorists by any definition I know. Why not demand from the Gazans the number of their actual combatants who were killed in the just part of the Israeli war against Gaza, the war of combatant to combatant? So I will not cry for the 40,000, but I will definitely cry for the 25,000. And this matters. This matters because anyone using the numbers without mentioning that the war is against the militants, first and foremost, is not a friend of Israel and is not a friend of Israeli civil society, which is still hurting and grieving and discovering horrible things every day anew, and getting bodies of soldiers and hostages almost every week. If you do not reach out to Israeli civil society, and hopefully to Palestinian civil society insofar as it has or develops a moderate edge, we will never be able to renew the figures of 2010. But the clear fact is that we can renew 2010 because people change, countries change, societies change. And with a powerful future-oriented movement by the responsible adults among the global community, by the powers for the good, is totally doable and could change the minds and hearts of many decent Israelis and hopefully Palestinians. We need that to happen. So please do not underestimate the power of hope, the power of empathy. I'm surrounded by people in my own spheres who are horribly sad for the innocent Gazans. It's a legitimate opinion to put forward in the Israeli media, even if it's not a majority opinion. We need your support. We need your support against our own horrific government and prime minister. We need your support against the worst government that Israel has ever had. We need your support against the government that has persuaded the world that all Israelis are to blame. So leaders and politicians, I have no hopes from the United Nations, I'm afraid, but leaders and politicians, democratic, peace-seeking leaders and politicians around the world, ought to reach out to Israeli civil society. And if you want to sanction the settlers, you've already begun to do that, the West Bank, wild West Bank criminal elements, and those who support them and silently give them a backing. And sanction the politicians who speak and act like genocidal maniacs. My politicians, unfortunately. Do not sanction or turn your back on Israeli civil society. Do not boycott academia. Academia is the cradle, one cradle of Israeli liberalism, democracy, and the hope for peace. Think of what you're doing. We need all the help we can get. Thank you.
Gracias, Fania. Thank you, Fania. I'm so sorry that the peace force or the moderate opinion in Israel was so much against the United Nations. Well, we need United Nations. Nothing can be done without United Nations. And
by the way, this goes for UNRWA. We also need UNRWA because there is no feasible Palestinian humanitarian effort in Gaza without UNRWA. So of course we need the United Nations and UNRWA. I only wish that they were friends to both sides, and I think then.
And I think it's a little bit unfair to say that the United Nations has been attacking Israel and not doing the same thing with Iran or with North Korea. Iran and North Korea are the most sanctioned countries in the world. And as far as I know, there is no sanctions against Israel. Come on, don't compare Iran and North Korea are the most sanctioned countries in the world.
No, I'm talking about the Security Council decisions to reproach countries in the world. This is where Israel leads by a margin of about 400 decisions over any other country.
Bueno, ahí podríamos discutir mucho. En todo caso, esas resoluciones.
I think we could say a lot because we're going to have resolutions, but the
Israeli government today, Judea and Samaria, which shows the real will of occupation, has been multiplied by 4 since the Oslo agreements. So we can say whatever we want, and the United Nations can repeat condemnations and warnings, but nothing stopped the colonization. So in fact, what's going on is a movement that the United Nations has not been able to stop. Nobody has been able to stop. Yes, there are many resolutions, and believe me, there is a lot also of statements from the European Union against the process of colonization. But it continues. It continues, and when we talk about the two-state solution, more and more, and state needs a land, under which land the state will be funded. I give the floor to ones who want to take the floor again. Yes, we are here to discuss. It's a unique occasion. It's a unique occasion in which
thank you,
UNRWA, General Commissioner and representatives of the Israeli civil society and the European Union and the academia. I think this can be recorded, and we publish a book at the end of this seminar. We publish a book with all the contributions, and you will have the opportunity to correct it, whatever you don't want to be unwritten. But it's important that this kind of discussion takes place, and we talk to each other, even it is to blame and to say, don't believe you. But if we are not able to discuss, then it's impossible to reach any kind of solution. So we were supposed to finish, but let's continue, because I thank you to be here, and I want to use this opportunity as much as I can. So.
Thank you so much. Just on what I heard, few comments. But let's go on UNRWA right now, because as we know, the campaign against the organization is unabated. I don't believe it's just the organization. There is a much broader agenda. The entry point for this attack, for the time being, are very much related to the collusion between the agency and Hamas, because of the footprint of the agency in Gaza, where we have 30,000 staff, where basically we were providing education to more than half the population. All of a sudden, this proximity has been part of the initial equation after October 7, when we heard politicians saying, Hamas is Gaza, Gaza is Hamas, UNRWA is Gaza, UNRWA is Hamas. Basically, we had this simplification, which we heard right from the beginning. Now, let's be very clear. Like any UN organization or public administration, we have a policy framework, and we expect that staff behave like civil servants and basically allege to the role of civil servant. So there is absolutely no room for any staff to be a so-called member of an armed group, whether Hamas or any other Palestinian group, and at the same time to be a UN employee. This means immediate dismissal. But I want also to be clear that just saying there are a list of names is no proof. I don't know any administration in a functioning democratic state based on rule of law which, on the basis of list, dismiss staff. We need to assess if yes or not there is substance. Now, there have been an investigation for 19 people whose conclusions are very well known. And unfortunately, despite months of cooperation with the Israeli, this investigation ended up inconclusive. But then we keep hearing about hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and we talk here about a list. We hear about our premises being used for weapons, to hide weapons. We hear about tunnels. We hear about combatants using our premises. We hear about our premises or people killed in UN premises. I do believe that for that we need a proper investigation. We need a board of inquiry. We need to find the facts. We need to corroborate the facts. For the time being, there is a huge propaganda going on. No one has access to Gaza, and the only we have to believe are those involved in the conflict. So I'm just here calling for a word of caution. We cannot take information at a face value. This information needs to be double-checked. Now, anyone will believe what they want to believe, but in such highly emotional, divided type of environment, I'm just calling for caution on this one. The other point is on the, I think, Jean-Pierre, you said many times, statu quo is not an option. The problem is we have believed over the last 15 years, since Hamas took over Gaza, that statu quo can be an option, that there was a certain comfort in the way the situation was dealt with, and despite the fact that there have been brutal conflict, there was still a confidence that containment can be the answer. And basically, we each time try to resolve the conflict with the same recipe, which is nothing else than insanity, without looking at having a lasting, proper solution. Despite the warning, despite the fact that a number of voices within the international community warn this is not tenable in the longer term, but because of this complacency and confidence in the containment, no one really listened to that. Now, an observation on the, I'm not a researcher, I have not all the data behind it, but just an observation on the two-state solution. When I started as Commissioner General in 2020, I was struck to see that within the Palestinian society, what leads the youth and whatever, the two-state solution, no one really was interested anymore. And there was in 2020 a kind of a shift where people say, we prefer a one-state solution because at least our struggle will turn into the equal right struggle with the Israeli. And that was quite strong. The point is, within the international community, no one really wanted to hear this because no one really wants to hear about that. At least the politician, the old guard of the Palestinian politician in Israel, not really until the day what you just described about one state, yes, but as it is a dominated, unequal type of a state, that could be a solution. I see, but let me do a last point. if you allow, and I will be very short. I've been in Gaza in and out for 35 years. During the first Intifada, it was a period full of hope. Palestinian, Israeli knew each other. In every household in Gaza, you had someone speaking in Hebrew, or a household was in business relations with an Israeli. You came back 30 years later, a Gazan doesn't know an Israeli or vice versa. You have no one below the age of 60 who speaks Hebrew. They are just strangers. Talking about the interdependency, there was a belief that we can't separate them. Now, 30 years later, we realize this has been a huge, huge mistake.
The most separate part of the Israel-Palestine arena was Gaza. It's not working.
Yeah, I stop here.
Dear High Representative and Vice President, just a few words from the superbly expressed presentation that you heard all today. We can now gather the conclusion that the issue of peace and war in the Middle East is not only a tragedy in the making under our very eyes between Israelis and Palestinians, but it is something that is jeopardizing the very basis of international order. And if there is something in common between United Nations and the European Union, it's the rule of law. And if crime remains without sanction, if criminals can go free and commit new crimes again and again, it's not only very bad news for both Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East, it's an existential threat to the international order and European Union. Thank you.
Es una amenaza no solo para lo que ocurre en el terreno, sino
it is a threat not only for those who are living there in the region, but for all of us. I would like to mention the fact that a high representative told us that the Netanyahu government has been promoting the funding of Hamas from other countries.
Hamas.
So funds coming from others. The Minister Motrich mentioned that Hamas was the most active or most important asset.
Everyone who is against the two-state solution has to do what we do. It is to support and contribute to finance Hamas. It's public. It has been in the Knesset. It's being published by the press. And everybody knows that, I'm not saying that the Israelis created Hamas. No, Hamas was created by the Palestinian people. But I have witnessed on the highest level of the United Nations saying, yes, it has been funded, facilitated the funding by the Israeli government.
Including in the early stage.
And at a certain moment, I decided to stop my cooperation with this channel of funding to Hamas. So when you talk about Hamas, I think that there is also a responsibility from the side of the Israeli government that has to be also put on the table. It doesn't justify at all what Hamas did. And I want to tell you, Fania, that the public opinion in Europe, I am sure here also, is very much on the right of having the existence of Israel secured. So from this point of view, we can call us Zionists. Because we accept the fact that there is a state where the Jewish people are organizing their life as community. Nobody in Europe is against the state of Israel. Be sure of that. The great majority of the public opinion, but at the same time, we are more and more concerned by the situation of the Palestinians and by the situation of the people in Gaza. And recognizing that what Hamas did was not justified, impossible to justify from the point of view of our values. One horror cannot justify another horror. And today what we are seeing is a horror that cannot be justified by any means. I don't know how many Hamas soldiers has been killed during the war. I don't know, nobody knows. You don't know, I don't know, nobody knows. But the fact is that the destruction, systematic destruction of Gaza is something that many European leaders have been raising their voice, saying, look, too many people have been killed. This is not just the right of defense. And
yes, this is what we in the opposition are saying too.
Good. It's important that on this point of view, we agree in order to raise our voices. But then action doesn't follow. Action doesn't follow. When people say too many people have been killed, okay, and then what? I heard Kamala Harris saying exactly the same thing that many of my colleagues have been saying. Too many people have been killed. Right, and then what? And then nothing. Diplomatic pressure. It seems that it's not enough. So then what? And the answer doesn't come because diplomatic pressure, as you said, the US has been unable to put in place a peace, not a peace, a ceasefire agreement. How many months has been negotiated? Who is guilty for not having this plan agreed and put into action? So don't be sure that in Europe, people are not at all against the existence of the State of Israel, but they are very much increasingly concerned by the situation of the Palestinian people. And we have to work with you, and thank you for recognizing that you need our support, and I need your action, because if we don't change the parameters of the action of the Israeli government, it's not going to be a solution.
On this, we are in full agreement, and I thank you for spelling it out.
I think we have 100 people here listening to you, and I'm sure some of them would like to say something. If you still have time in order to take questions from these 100 people that came here in order to learn and to understand better the conflict and the possible solutions. They are a good representation of the Spanish civil society. Who wants to take the floor? Guillaume. Let's give the floor to a French.
Yes, I'm not representative of the Spanish civil society. Guillaume Duval. One remark and one question. The first remark is the right-wing orientation of the Israeli society. It's not a big problem for me because only a right-wing government in Israel could make peace. That is our experience as French with the Algeria colonial war. Many left governments have tried and failed. Only a right-wing general was able to make peace. Okay, the question was regarding the Palestinian civil society. You spoke of the Palestinian as a whole. What I have read from different polls by the organism you mentioned was that there is a big difference between what is thought in West Jordan and in Gaza regarding the 7th of October and so on. Could you please explain a bit about it?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'm going to try to do this pretty quick so I can leave time for everybody. The right wing, I definitely take the point, and we have evidence of some examples like this in Israeli history as well. It was, of course, Prime Minister Menachem Begin, the first right-wing prime minister who signed a full peace treaty with Egypt, which has been a remarkably enduring success despite extreme pressures on that peace agreement, so that we have this model. The problem is that it would work if you have a prime minister or leader who wants to get to that direction and then enjoys the support of the public behind him or her. But when you have a right-wing leadership that is completely committed to undermining that, that is the self-reinforcing problem. So yes, I can see the model, which is why I do think there's an opportunity if in the next election the leading party is either the one that is coming in first or second place in surveys right now, led by Benny Gantz, who's a former military person who is currently doing best in polls, or almost the best, and other right-wing figures, like Fania said. I don't think we should underestimate how right-wing they are. Naftali Bennett, when he entered politics, Fania, I remind you, he entered politics on a platform of annexation. So we have to be careful about what we can assume, but I do think they will be more open to changing Israel's direction from a completely isolated country with no international allies other than deeply undemocratic authoritarian allies. And so if they are in government, they might want to be working in more coordinated ways with the international community to get there. So I appreciate the point. In terms of Gaza and the West Bank, yeah, the divisions have been there in the past. They are much bigger after the war. In terms of support for October 7th, they are high on both sides. Very small, only marginal differences in terms of the level of support. Now, you have to qualify what it means for people to answer surveys in the situation in Gaza right now. I mean, I don't really have the words to describe the situation of life there. So if you're, and the level of fear too, because Hamas, after 10 months of war, is still fundamentally in control. And so there's a lot of questions about what this really means. Plus, they don't believe or know, or don't know and therefore don't believe, or don't believe and therefore don't know about the full extent of what happened on October 7th. I would never defend these attitudes, but there's not a huge difference between Gaza and the West Bank on that. Where there is a major difference is what to do next and support for Hamas. And that's where you see big divisions, much more critical attitudes among Gazans for the situation at present, for the consequences of the war, for even support for Hamas. It's lower in Gaza, and it has gained much less than in the West Bank. In the West Bank, support for Hamas went way up. In Gaza, very little. And the reasons are very obvious, but I would never trust my own instincts. What I hear from Palestinians from Gaza and Palestinian analysts that I work with is that, of course, Palestinians in Gaza are the ones living with the consequences. They have been living with the consequences of Hamas, which is an authoritarian, theocratic, repressive regime, and has not advanced their position. And now they are living the consequences of the war, while in the West Bank there is such a consuming sense of fury and tragedy and anger and sadness for what's happening in Gaza, but they feel very helpless. The number one emotion that Palestinians point to in a different survey from a different organization is helplessness. And so I think there's a feeling in the West Bank that all they can do is talk about how supportive they are of this action. This is the explanation that my Palestinian colleagues will tell me of these kinds of surveys. But there are deep divisions, and they have gotten much deeper during the war.
¿Más preguntas?
More questions? More questions? Maybe at the back. Bueno.
Excellent. Excellent. Bueno, voy a hablar en español porque me entiendo mejor. Gracias.
To speak in Spanish. Thank you. Thank you for the questions of this morning. I've got a question. And looking at the differences that have been mentioned between the society of West Bank and Gaza, have you thought about the solution of the three states, Israel, Gaza, and West Bank? I can answer in Spanish, although the question was in English. The fact of dividing the West Bank and Gaza is an old project that comes from the colonial times. And if we go through this track, we're going to be in a worse situation than the current one. The High Court of Justice, in its resolution of last month, has insisted on the fundamental unity of the occupied Palestine territory. And this occupied Palestine territory includes the east of Jerusalem. It's not only West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It is the whole territory and the only one that is occupied. The UN uses the singular for this word, but the press and the politicians uses the plural, the Palestinian territories. So if we block this area during 16 years, of course, we will have differences with the other part that is not under siege or blocked. But the major unity of the Palestinian people is at the heart of the future of both peoples, because it is a matter of the right to self-determination of people that has been denied this right a million of times. I mean, because the world has been the cause of that, and it has been mentioned, or I mentioned it during my presentation, my talk. The High Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, considers that any state that is denying this most sacred right to the Palestinians are participating in this denial. Would it be the Gaza Strip, West Bank, or East Jerusalem? More questions? Your court started overwhelmed, I guess.
Après 10 mois de cette guerre, moi, ce que je me demande quand je regarde des informations, par exemple sur Arte, comment est-ce il y a deux choses. Comment est-ce possible, un, que les Palestiniens puissent survivre à Gaza, malgré, depuis 10 mois, on dit qu'ils vivent dans des conditions inhumaines.
We're really sorry, but there's no French interpretation till this afternoon, so unfortunately there's no French interpretation.
N'est pas vaincu le Hamas. Merci.
Otra pregunta. Otra pregunta.
Another question. Good morning. Thank you for the talks, great talks of the different members of the panels. I would like to talk about what has been said by High Representative, a long list of political analysts, in the sense that I don't know whether you have checked that, but I would like to know more about that. The fact that Israel, a few decades ago, founded Hamas with the clear objective to weaken the OLP, to the PLO, sorry, to get to be in a better position in Israel. If it is the case, it's really serious, and I don't know whether it has been like that, or maybe it's a fake news, but I would like to have your confirmation if it's right. Well, we don't have a notary signing it. There wasn't a notary registering this, but everyone that knows the problem knows what the answer is.
I'm really sorry, he just shut off his microphone. Any other questions?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate the speakers for such interesting and illustrative presentations. I would like to ask about the paradox that on many occasions we see the EU as the candidate to moderate the issue of Israel and Palestine, when on the other hand we have a past with them that makes us be far away from some of the parties, and we don't seem to be the most impartial agent because of the lack of unity in Europe. So as we are quite limited in our capabilities because our powers on foreign policy is what it is, and we depend on the unity of the 27 that is difficult to achieve. And because beyond those competences and capabilities, there's no joint idea of what we want to achieve as the EU. I'm asking myself if the EU should be the main moderator in this issue, or maybe there's another regional actor like a Gulf state or Saudi Arabia that might have more respect of both parties and greater capacity to intervene and bring this problem to a solution. One last question over there.
Hola, buenos.
Good morning. Welcome to my city. I have a comment. I believe Netanyahu and his government are not really being helpful for Israel because of their behavior, and that's how it's perceived almost everywhere in the world. For years, they've been provoking hate, in my view, by settling in different lands and attacking Palestinians. As human beings, we feel the suffering of these children that are bombed. I, as a mother and grandmother, cry for those children in Gaza. And borders, yes, but we would have to bring those territories back to their previous situation, something that Israel will never accept. On the other hand, the attitude of the U.S. is unacceptable. That's my view. And now Blinken says that they are close to a ceasefire. Do you have any information on how the negotiations are going? Thank you. I will be answering. It is true that the EU has never used its political capital and political capacity and committed itself to finding a solution to the conflict. And it's been so for a long time. It was the EU that invented, if I'm not wrong, in Venice in 1980. Is that true? Professor, in Venice in 1980, we had that declaration in which the EU expressed its will to go to the core of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that the solution was the two states. But we've done very little, or almost nothing, to build on this solution, because this meant a political commitment, and structurally, we've removed ourselves from this process and left it in the hands of the U.S. so that they could solve it, and they weren't able to solve it either. And right now, we continue repeating the mantra of the two states as the solution that we support, but that's it. That's it. We just talk about this idea, and of course there's a division, and I'm the first to suffer it, between the member states that has diminished our capacity to intervene, up to the point that now it's some member states, the ones taking initiatives like Spain, for example, because we see that it's impossible to have a European dynamic. I've tried. I've invited the Arab countries. They've come to Brussels to the council. I've invited the foreign ministers. But at the end of the day, when we say, let's start a process, let's have a conference, let's discuss with the Arab states little by little, but let's start a process that allows not only humanitarian aid, that of course here we're doing much more, but to favor a ceasefire. No, we're not in the negotiations for the ceasefire. We're not. I am informed of what's happening, but I'm not one of the main actors there. No one in Europe is. And of course, trying to find a political solution. Many member states say we have to leave Israel do what it has to do. Yes, we will take care of the wounded, the killed, and we will try to be the Good Samaritan. We will create a maritime corridor from Cyprus. We will bring food through a parachuting. There's solutions that are not useful, really, as we've seen, but there is a clear will of some member states of not going beyond that. Why? Because Israel has to end what it has to end. And what does it have to do? To take over Hamas. And the question is how they haven't been able to do so in 10 months, nor they know where the hosts are after leveling Gaza. Leveling Gaza. This is a term used by the military in an urban area. You cannot work with 3 dimensions. You have to reduce it to 2 dimensions. And you do this by reducing the 3rd dimension, height, and by leveling everything. And this is what's happening. If you look at the air pictures, they are horrible. How have Palestinians survived? How do they continue living in worse and worse conditions? And the director of UNRWA knows this, and we have information on different illnesses from the World Health Organization. You tell me that your heart breaks when you see the images. Well, I must say European television show very few images. If you stop in an Arab airport while you wait for your next plane and you look at the images by Arab televisions, they have very different from what we see here. And those images are overwhelming, horrible, terrible. And the Arab population and the Arab states, they see this each and every day, almost in a closed loop, but we don't see them, or we see very little, very, very little. I don't know if there is some kind of self-censorship or why, but the fact is that our concept of the conflict is much more limited than that of other countries. And you know the saying, if you don't see something, you don't feel it. Well, we are not seeing enough the concern and the seriousness of the drama, and that's why our heart feels, but not so much as it will if our eyes were able to see each and every day what is being seen in other countries, which also explains the attitude of the public opinion in other countries. Unfortunately, I cannot say that the EU is going to be a decisive force. It hasn't been up till now. It is true that some European states have a feeling of guilt because of what happened with the Holocaust, and for them, it's a basic principle of its foreign policy to support Israel in its right to defend itself. But the right to defend itself is not questioned by anyone, but the right to defend yourself has its limits, like all rights. And the problem is to know if we've gone beyond the limits. And I personally, and I say this personally, not representing anyone, I believe that obviously we've gone beyond the limits. And in the same way that there is a systematic blockage to the access of humanitarian aid, that some ministers of the Israeli government have explained it as a political will. A minister has said the good thing, what we should do is for all of them to die, for all of them to starve to death. But the international community wouldn't allow us to do this. When you hear statements such as this by someone that is a minister in a government, you feel horrible regarding the dynamic existing, because this is not going to end here, and we've sown the seeds for future conflicts. That's why it's so important to provide support to peace, because if we are not able to generate a dynamic that brings a will of finishing with this spiral of violence in both populations, we will continue thus generation after generation and funeral after funeral. And we Europeans have a great responsibility regarding what's happening. So when I hear many leaders say what's happening is horrible, I remember the name of the book of Mrs. Alstom that's written a book that's called And Then What? So, and then what? That's what we ask ourselves now. Too many people have been killed. This is what Madam Harris have said. Yes, too many people have been killed. But then what? That's the question we should ask ourselves. At least that's what I ask myself each and every day, and I will continue asking this in the Council of Ministers of Foreign Affairs. Is there anything that we can do? Of course, humanitarian aid is fundamental because there's people suffering, and we can alleviate somehow part of this suffering. But let's see what happens with the next General Assembly of United Nations in the last week of September. If the international community is not able to at least organize a meeting to address the problem, as we did in the previous meeting. I was in the meeting organized by Norway, US, and Saudi Arabia, where most people were in favor of two states, and we left the meeting wanting to work for this. And a few weeks later, the unjustified Hamas terrorist attack took place, and everything went to another dimension. But we cannot always be in this other dimension. That's why if in the next General Assembly the international community is not able to at least speak collectively about the problem, then I don't know what can be mobilized. In any case, what's clear is that Netanyahu's government that has repeated this over and over again, it's not that I attribute an intention to them. They say they will do anything possible for there not to be two states, and they present themselves as the firm guarantee of this never happening. It is so. They say, I'm the guarantee that there will never be a Palestinian state. So the question that we should ask is, and then what? So what's your solution to the problem? What is your solution? You don't want the two states. And you don't want to give Palestinians full rights so they can coexist together with Israelis in one only state. And after what's happened, this is almost impossible to even imagine. So what's your solution then? Little by little taking the territory of the Palestinians, and little by little displacing the Palestinians that live there as it's happening. But where does this policy take us? We should ask from the Israeli government, what is your solution? They never say what the solution is going to be. They just act. But this cannot be accepted by the international community because it goes against any sentence of the courts and all the resolutions. I don't know if you want to add anything else. Anything from the panel?
Just watch what they do. If you want to know what the Israeli government wants, watch what they do.
Watch what they do. Es lo que digo. Es lo que digo. No dice.
That's exactly what I'm saying. They don't say what they want, but they do. But what they do is unacceptable from the legal standpoint, and from the moral standpoint, and from the standpoint of the rights that we consider to be universal and that we defend, and that we've defended, for example, in Ukraine too.
very profound words by the High Representative, something that is very simple, but that as a historian I have to recall. It's much easier to make war than peace, much easier. The real courage is in waging peace, not in making war. Apart from the fact that between the Israelis and the Palestinians there is absolutely no military solution possible. When one says he wants total victory, that means he wants eternal war, never-ending war, which is not something the Middle East can't afford. That's obvious, especially the Palestinian people, but the world in general, and Europe in particular, can't afford an open-ended war, and even without regional escalation. You know, what is happening is already horrendous enough to move all goodwills in the same direction. But why is peace so difficult? Because peace is trusting the other, while during the war you trust only yourself, your forces, your armaments. And it's not only trusting the other for you and your loved one, but it's trusting the other, the hated other, the arch-enemy, because I insist, you make peace with your enemy. If you want to pick up the moderate you want to make peace with, you will never achieve peace. You make peace with your enemy, with precisely the party you want to defeat. And this peace is so difficult because you have to trust your enemy with the security of your children and your grandchildren. There is no highest act of courage than that. But because it's so difficult, then the two friends of the Israelis, the true friends of the Palestinians, have to stand there and to support them on their struggle to peace. Thank you.
Sus verdaderos amigos.
Unión Europea.
Who are their true friends? The EU. The true friends of both are here. If not the Arabs, the Russians, the Americans, for the others, they are just bringing them to a pit that has no bottom. The problem is that in the EU, we have some supporting one side and some supporting the other. But objectively, the EU would be the main financing for the Palestinian Authority comes from the EU. And it is also true that we need to recognize that there has been a negative attitude of some in the EU, for example, not providing help to the authority was nonsense. It couldn't be justified. Palestine had nothing to do with the Hamas action. So this was really unjustified. And as a High Representative, I fought against this. I wanted it to be immediately corrected. But in Europe, there is a different vision of the problem, very different. Some states recognize the Palestinian state, and others consider that it's an action that goes against the peace and don't want to work on it, and others go beyond, and their support to the idea of two states, I must recognize, is just formal. No one really is courageous enough to say, no, I don't want the resolution of two states. Because the main question is that if you don't want this solution, what's your solution then? Philip?
Because we had a discussion, but in a certain extent, there is nothing else on the table than the two-state solution. But we also know the two-state solution has been kept artificially alive, and no one really wanted to bury it by fear to come with another proposal, and no one really had another proposal for the time being. And I have to say that listening to, I mean, there was a pre-October 7, but there was a tendency at the time to shift the struggle from self-determination to equal right. And I believe that this, at one point, will come back on the table because we will have to deal with realities. And reality for the time being is that in the absence of a genuine will to promote, to impose a peace and a political solution and a two-state solution, we will go back to this long, protracted situation, which after that we will define as being the new statu quo. And this is not a viable solution because it's a recipe for disaster in the future again. Non, c'est bon. Mais j'ai fini. No, my point here is we have to be careful not to create a new statu quo in the future. And if we fail to mobilize member states and create and feed this appetite for genuine two-state solution now, we will create a new statu quo. We will go back to the so-called containment policy, and basically we will sow the seeds for new disaster in the making for future generation in the region. And this is exactly what we have to avoid, and I believe this is what is at stake. My last point is, I don't think, and Joseph, you were mentioning that maybe in Europe we don't see enough of the horror in Gaza. My fear is that we start to get too much used to the horror that we see in Gaza. We were shocked at the beginning, but look at last week. We were talking about 40,000 people killed, and most likely this is underestimated. We have talked about all the possible misery and horror that people are confronted with, but ultimately this ends up to be figures. We were shocked when the 10 first kids were burned in a school, but when we talk about 40,000 today and months later, tens of thousands more of these people, basically we take it as any other type of information. My fear is a banalization of this horror, and through this we are more and more losing our ability to be compassionate and to feel for others. Thank you.
¿Nadie quiere añadir nada más?
Does anyone want to add something? If no one wants to add something, is it very, very important? Is it really important? I'm sure it is. Let's give the floor to this young gentleman. Because you're young. If you're not, you wouldn't get the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I will be brief. My question doesn't have to do so much with the events in history, but more to European society and Spanish society. As a student, I'm a student of international relations in the Complutense University in Madrid. And my feeling, there is a lot of politicization in both sides. And this is something that you can almost not even discuss. You cannot reflect on something without being attacked or pointed out as so-and-so. So what is the path that we need to take to promote consensus and to have a fruitful discussion, listening to what others have to say? Thank you. Well, I believe that's exactly what we're doing right now with dialogue. We need to provide support to people like Fania. And of course, I believe we need to support the work of Lazzarini, people like Dalia. And in the European society, we have to run away from extremism. any anti-Semitic reaction has to be immediately condemned, because we're not blaming an ethnic group or a people, but we are politically analyzing what people in government are doing on the one side and on the other. And it is true that what's happening is that there is an anti-Semitic dynamic too that we have to stop immediately, because this is what legitimizes us, and I will be the first to do so. And it is true that every time you say something against the Israel government, you're considered to be a Jew. That's what Kissinger said. If you're 90% in agreement, but you disagree in a 10%, then you're considered to be anti-Semitic. It's impossible to say something against Netanyahu's government without saying that you're anti-Semitic. But we need to stop this anti-Semitic movement in social media, wherever, because that's the worst of the paths to take, and to support civil society that wants peace. We won't be achieving anything more than peace and promoting dialogue. I've organized dialogues between Israeli and Palestinian civil society, and we will continue to organize them. If we close the doors to dialogue, then we will be, because you've said that even here amongst us, it's difficult to dialogue, and that very quickly there's tension, and that you are not able to discuss openly. And this is happening between people that are here, that haven't suffered the loss of our parents, our children. Our home hasn't been destroyed. We haven't been removed from our land. We didn't live in a kibbutz where suddenly a terrorist group came and killed people. We haven't gone through these tragedies, but however, even though we're not directly affected by the problem, it is difficult for us to discuss, because very quickly feelings are taken into account beyond reason, or more than reason. So imagine for them, imagine this lack of human empathy for the pain of the other, not taking into account what is happening to others, which is something that we should avoid. And we need to support the people that feel the pain of others as their own pain. And that's what we are trying to do, knowing that there are no magical solutions. If there were, someone would have found them. But we have to say no to those that promote hate speech, and that promote hate in general terms, and that do not admit the existence of others, because this would just bring us to the continuance of the conflict. We could continue, and we should have finished half an hour ago, but you have one last opportunity to intervene if you want to. Anyone in the panel? One last chance to say something?
You can never give up an opportunity to say something. I think that, for one thing, I do think there are alternatives to the old atrophied life support two-state solution. Two states based on partnership, something like you have in the EU, is the only way forward as far as I can tell, and I would like for the EU to start thinking about this so that you can start promoting it and putting these ideas on the table, including with other policymakers. The other thing that I think I was thinking about while my colleagues were talking is that we should not be hostage to the idea that everything will be perfect. And if we can't get to perfection, there's no point. We can do better. Nothing will resolve all the violence. Yes, peace takes courage, but it's also, you know, if people think about it as some perfect world, they will always only be disappointed. We have to understand that humanity is, we are nasty and violent and brutal. We have to live with it, but we can get better frameworks for containing it. And so on the way there, we will have continued violence, and there will be more violence after there's a peace agreement. And we can't give up on it for that reason. But we will have better frameworks to contain it and channel it into political institutions. Thank you.
So maybe I can add a few words, if I may.
Yes, yes, certainly. Thank you.
Yes, I want to thank the audience members for the excellent and the well-phrased questions. And to remind you, I'm sure it was also mentioned at the beginning of the panel before I got online, that this panel is a little uneven in the sense that two members are heads of institutions, international institutions, whereas Dalia Scheindlin and I are academics and members of civil society. So whatever you say here against the Netanyahu government, if it is not patently false, of course, but fact-based, I couldn't agree more, and we are even more critical. Please keep this in mind. Now, there was a question about why not divide Palestine into Gaza and West Bank, and of course there was an explanation why this cannot be the case, but we all have a fantasy of separating between ourselves and our own fanatics. And in Israel too, there's talk about dividing Israel into two states, the modern liberal Israel and the religious nationalist fanatic Jehuda. Or Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, if you like. This is a fantasy. We cannot differentiate ourselves from our own fanatics in our countries. Think about your own countries and the extremists there. Imagine yourself in a state of war with the extremists having taken over the government. We cannot. We have to accommodate them. And I also want to add that as long ago as 1995, even before the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, which changed history dramatically, my late father, Amos Oz, wrote an article in the New York Times saying that Hamas and Likud are partners strategically. That was prophetic, because he understood that Likud wants to hear nothing about the two-state solution or about an Israeli-Palestinian agreement or about the PLO and Fatah Palestinian Authority. And hence, the Likud and Hamas have mirroring but equal, comparable agendas to grab it all for themselves. And this was paradoxically the underlying reason for the help that the Likud governments, Netanyahu governments have enabled from Qatar into Gaza and right into the tunnels and the weaponry of Hamas. But we are standing, and as I always have ever since I came into adulthood, for a solution which would be viable according to the best that we know. And the best that we know is that one state will not work. People here call it by the code name equal rights. So to give equal civic rights to everyone from the river to the sea, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, and call it one state, obviously they assume it will be a secular liberal state. It cannot be religiously governed, obviously, and it cannot be illiberal, obviously. But where will this come from? There is now a minority, but a very large minority of Israeli secular liberals. Maybe we could win the day in Israel, but who will win the day in Palestine? I would like you to keep in mind, and I have to say this as a left liberal Israeli, that the numbers of Palestinian moderates have diminished dramatically over the years. Partially the blame of Israel too, but not only. Their own leaderships haven't done much for that. Certainly not in Gaza. So whom are we supposed to have one state with? People who are by the 90+% keen on having us eliminated? I really need to put this forward. Also the fact that with the misery and calamity and crimes and death toll in Gaza, and the crimes done by Israeli settlers with the army looking on in the West Bank. As to the Gaza war, I have to mention that Hamas could have released the hostages anytime. Putting a stop to the war, and maybe all the way to a permanent agreement. This has not been done. The hostages are still there. Those who are alive, not that many of them. This has to be on the table, because if you don't want to approach the Israeli peace camp, the Israeli liberal left and center, and keep talking about one side's misery truly and justly, and forget the other side's misery, not a very good tactics. Once again, I call upon you, both my co-panelists and the audience here, to reach out to the Israeli moderates and to seek out Palestinian moderates, because these are the only hopes we have. And we need both. Please listen to both sides and share empathy with both sides and look for people who are capable of empathy among Israelis and among Palestinians. Very few in the Palestinian side, this has to be said honestly. You can justify them, you can go back to history, but this is the situation today. Empower the moderates for a peace of the moderates. And I see no replacement for the two-states model, not in our lifetime, maybe in a generation or two. Maybe a confederation, maybe one state, maybe there will be no state but a world republic, as Immanuel Kant wanted us to have. But for now, once again quoting my late father, we need a fair divorce. Yes, we need to put a wall of peace, a fence of peace between the two countries and create a sovereign, viable Palestine, hopefully, eventually liberal democratic. Thank you for listening.
Pues muchas gracias a todos. Hemos superado con creces el tiempo.
Thank you very much to you all. We are a bit late, but we wanted to have a representative for Israel and Palestine, but we wanted to have the representative we haven't got. We wanted to have someone on Zoom, but it hasn't been possible. And so we will still be talking about that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias a todos. Comenzamos esta tarde a las 4:30.
This afternoon at 4:30, talking about the challenges of climate change. 4:30, thank you.